Hi guys, and welcome to History That Makes You Sleepy tonight. You arrive just a little too late. A thin layer of ash drifts slowly through the air, settling softly on your shoulders, light as snow but warmer than it should be. You brush it away without thinking, only to notice how quiet everything is. No footsteps, no distant voices, not even the sound of wind. Just a stillness that feels unnatural. You take a slow breath, and there is a faint, bitter taste in the air. It lingers longer than expected. You pause, 'cause something here does not quite make sense, and the more you notice, the clearer it becomes. If you were truly standing here, you would not have time to understand it. You probably would not survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, flow straight into the story. You stand beside a wagon somewhere along the Oregon Trail, and the first thing you notice is not the cold. That comes later. The first thing you notice is the smell: wet canvas, damp wool, oxen, smoke from half-green firewood that refuses to burn properly. Underneath all of it sits the sharp mineral scent of snow drifting in from the plains. Modern people tend to imagine winter as clean and fresh. Trail winter is neither. It smells tired. The evening sky hangs low and grey, pressing against the open prairie as though the clouds themselves have grown too exhausted to float any farther. A few snowflakes tumble sideways in the wind, uncertain at first. The travellers around you glance upward with the quiet suspicion of people who already know what kind of night is coming. Nobody says it directly. That would waste energy. Instead, everyone moves a little faster. A historical reality often overlooked today is that many emigrants on the Oregon Trail travelled dangerously late into the season. Thousands underestimated the distance west, especially after difficult river crossings, broken wagon axles, illness, or delays caused by overloaded supplies. By the time early snowstorms arrived across Wyoming or the Blue Mountains, families could find themselves trapped in conditions they never intended to face. And unfortunately, you are one of them. You pull your coat tighter, it barely helps. The wind slips through seams and stitching with insulting ease, like nature personally resenting your optimism. Your boots sink into slushy mud already turning stiff beneath the evening frost. Nearby, a woman shakes a blanket hard enough to send snow dust spiraling into the air. Two children gather dry buffalo chips for fuel with the solemn concentration of tiny accountants, managing the world's worst budget. An older man coughs into his scarf and stares westward as though glaring at the mountains might somehow reduce their size. It does not. The oxen seem wiser than everyone else. They lower their heads and endure. You help guide one of the wagons into position beside the others. Contrary to the famous image, wagon trains did not always form perfect circles every night, like something from an old Western film. Historians frequently point out that many camps were arranged according to terrain, weather, or sheer exhaustion rather than neat defensive patterns. Tonight the wagons gather unevenly beside a shallow rise that blocks at least some of the wind. Not enough, though. Never enough. Snow begins falling more steadily now, thin white streaks slanting across the fading light. You hear the constant little noises of camp settling into survival mode. Iron chains clink softly. Leather creaks. Someone mutters a prayer while tying down a loose canvas flap. Somewhere in the distance, a mule complains with the emotional intensity of a 19th century customer service review. Honestly, the mule may have a point. You step around a muddy wheel rut half frozen at the edges. One careless movement could twist an ankle out here, and that would be catastrophic. Modern sidewalks suddenly seem like one of humanity's greatest achievements. The fire pit nearest you struggles into existence. The flames burn low and orange beneath damp wood. releasing more smoke than warmth. Your eyes sting immediately. Sparks rise and disappear into thickening snow. Still, everyone gathers close, because even a weak fire changes the psychology of night. A lesser-known trail anecdote from emigrant diaries describes people heating stones beside campfires and wrapping them in cloth before placing them beneath blankets. It was primitive, occasionally dangerous, and sometimes surprisingly effective. Of course, if the stone cracked from heat or moisture, congratulations! Your bed had briefly transformed into an explosion. Sleep on the Oregon Trail required optimism bordering on hallucination. You glance toward the horizon again. The plains have begun dissolving into pale grey haze. Land and sky slowly lose their edges until the entire world resembles a half-remembered dream. And the strange thing is how quickly silence changes once snow deepens. The daytime trail is loud. Wagon wheels shriek. Children cry. Drivers shout at oxen with vocabulary creative enough to concern modern HR departments. But snowfall swallows sound. Little by little, the storm muffles the world until voices become soft and distant. You feel it happening already. Someone hands you a tin cup of coffee boiled black enough to remove paint from furniture. You drink anyway. It tastes burnt, bitter, smoky, and vaguely medicinal. Perfect. Warmth travels slowly through your chest. For a moment, you almost relax. Then the wind shifts. Cold sweeps across the prairie in one long breath, lifting loose snow into twisting ribbons around the wagon wheels. Canvas covers snap sharply overhead. A child begins crying somewhere beyond the firelight. Not loudly, just enough to reveal fear. You look up. The storm has finally decided to arrive properly. Scholars continue debating how prepared the average emigrant truly was for severe winter exposure. Some argue most travellers possessed practical frontier knowledge from previous rural lives. Others believe many families, especially newer migrants from eastern cities, catastrophically underestimated Western weather. Standing here now, surrounded by freezing wind and failing light, you suspect both arguments can probably coexist. Human beings are very capable of being experienced and unprepared simultaneously. The camp leader moves through the gathering darkness, checking harnesses and wheel locks one last time. His beard carries little flecks of snow that never fully melt. He speaks quietly, conserving breath. Keep the children dry. Simple advice, a nearly impossible task. You kneel beside a pile of supplies wrapped beneath oilcloth, flour sacks, bacon, coffee tins, a cracked wooden box filled with tools. Every item matters. Storms on the trail did not merely threaten comfort, they threatened time, and time threatened food. One prolonged delay could begin a chain reaction no one wanted to think about. The fire pops softly. Snow gathers on your shoulders faster now. The cold no longer feels sharp and sudden. Instead, it creeps inward with patient confidence, settling into your fingers, ears, knees, and nose. This is what surprises you most. Not dramatic suffering, just persistence. Cold that never fully leaves. You crawl partially beneath the wagon to secure a loose strap and immediately smell earth, grease, mud, and old wood. The undercarriage groans gently above you. Snowflakes drift sideways underneath the wheels. Even the ground seems exposed. When you emerge again, twilight has almost vanished. Lantern light flickers weakly through blowing snow, turning faces gold and uncertain. Nobody talks much anymore. People save their energy for practical things, pulling blankets tighter, feeding animals, checking children's hands for numbness. You realize something quietly unsettling then. This night is not unusual, not legendary, not even especially famous. For thousands of emigrants moving west during the 19th century, nights like this simply became part of life. Miserable, exhausting, frightening life. Yes, but ordinary enough that people endured them, recorded them briefly in diaries, and continued onward because there was no real alternative except turning back. And turning back could be worse. The snow thickens around camp as darkness finally settles over the prairie. You pull yourself closer to the struggling fire and listen to the wind moving across the endless land. Tomorrow still feels impossibly far away. The wind grows harsher after full dark, though harsher somehow still feels too gentle a word. It does not strike you dramatically. It wears you down instead. Long steady pressure against your coat, your eyes, your patience, your optimism. Like the prairie itself has decided to lean on you until morning. You help drag another wagon closer to the loose shelter of the others. The wheels grind through snow packed over frozen mud, making a dull crunching sound that seems unnaturally loud in the storm. Every movement now happens with purpose. Nobody wanders. Nobody wastes steps. The camp spreads unevenly across the shallow rise. Wagons turned broadside against the prevailing wind where possible. Oxen stand tethered nearby, massive shapes barely visible through drifting snow. Their breath rises in slow white clouds, vanishing almost immediately into darkness. You can smell them before you fully see them. Warm hide, wet fur, manure steaming faintly in the cold. Oddly comforting smells tonight. One emigrant mutters that the animals probably have the correct idea about winter, grow thicker hair and stop pretending progress is enjoyable. Honestly, fair criticism. You tug frozen fingers beneath your arm for warmth and look around camp again. Fires flicker weakly between wagons, glowing orange beneath low-hanging smoke. Canvas covers billow and snap overhead. Somewhere nearby, a woman repeatedly shakes snow from a rope line before ice can freeze it solid. These tiny tasks never stop. That may be the most exhausting truth of trail life. Modern people imagine danger arriving in dramatic moments. Stampedes, river accidents, blizzards sweeping suddenly over mountains. But much of survival out here depends on endless maintenance. Tightening straps, drying socks, protecting flour, repacking supplies, checking wheel hubs, repeating the same uncomfortable tasks until your body forgets what rest actually feels like. A commonly accepted historical detail is that many emigrants slept either inside wagons or directly beneath them depending on weather conditions, available space, and family size. Contrary to modern assumptions, wagons themselves were often crowded with supplies rather than people. During storms, however, even cramped shelter became valuable. You crouch beside one wagon while a man secures an extra canvas sheet over exposed supplies. His hands move stiffly from cold. "Snow'll get into everything," he says quietly. "It already has." Snow clings to boots, blankets, collars, food sacks, eyelashes. It settles inside wagon seams and melts against body heat before freezing again. You begin understanding why diary entries from emigrants mention dampness almost as often as hunger. Cold alone is dangerous. Wet cold feels personal. Nearby, two boys struggle to gather enough brush for another fire. Their hats sit crooked over reddened ears. One carries a bundle of dry grass protected beneath his coat like priceless treasure. In a way, it is. You kneel to help them arrange kindling beneath a few reluctant branches. Smoke immediately blows into your face with the precision of an insult. Your eyes water. The smaller boy grins anyway. Better than no fire. Another excellent frontier slogan. Extremely depressing. Entirely accurate. The flames finally catch, trembling weakly at first before growing steadier. Light spills across nearby wagon wheels coated in crusted ice. Shadows stretch and contract across the snow. For a moment, camp almost feels peaceful. Then the wind changes direction again. Snow sweeps sideways between the wagons, hard enough to sting exposed skin. You turn instinctively, pulling your scarf higher across your mouth. A fringe detail, sometimes mentioned in trail journals, describes emigrants hanging quilts or spare cloth along wagon gaps to create temporary windbreaks between campsites. The method rarely worked perfectly, but even small barriers could reduce exposure enough to preserve heat around fires. Tonight, several families attempt exactly that. Blankets flap wildly between wagon tongues and wheel spokes, creating strange, narrow corridors through the storm. You move through one of these improvised passages and immediately notice the difference. Less wind, less drifting snow, slightly warmer air carrying the smell of stew. Tiny victories matter enormously here. Someone nearby stirs a pot suspended over low coals. Salt pork, beans, maybe onion if fortune briefly remembered your existence. These scents drift through camp rich and smoky enough to make your stomach tighten painfully. You realize you have been cold long enough that hunger now feels abstract. Your body simply wants heat in any available form. The woman tending the pot hands bowls carefully through the gathering darkness. Nobody complains about flavour. That luxury belongs to people indoors. You sit on an overturned crate beside the fire and balance the tin bowl between stiff hands. Steam curls upward against your face. The beans taste soft, salty, slightly burnt, and absolutely magnificent. The strange thing about hardship is how quickly standards reorganize themselves. Right now this meal feels close to luxury. Beyond the firelight, the prairie disappears entirely. You cannot tell where land ends and sky begins anymore. Snow moves through darkness in endless pale streaks, hypnotic and directionless. One older traveller quietly mentions hearing wolves 2 nights earlier farther east along the trail. Whether he truly heard them remains uncertain. Researchers still disagree about how commonly emigrants encountered organised wolf threats during winter crossings. Some accounts likely exaggerated danger afterward, while others may have minimised it to avoid frightening children or relatives back home. Either way, the possibility lingers comfortably nowhere in your mind. You glance toward the darkness anyway, because of course you do. An ox suddenly bellows somewhere beyond camp, deep and uneasy. Several people turn immediately toward the sound. Animals often sensed weather shifts before humans fully recognized them. Another unpleasantly useful frontier feature. Snow thickens again. You rise to help secure feed sacks beneath an oilcloth cover near the livestock line. The ground crunches beneath your boots, frozen harder now than earlier in the evening. Your fingers ache sharply while tightening rope knots. A woman nearby checks each child one by one before bedding them down. Hands first, ears second, toes if possible. Cold injuries began quietly. That frightened people more than dramatic suffering ever did. You remember reading once that many emigrants described winter exhaustion as something almost dreamlike. Not violent pain, just increasing heaviness, sleepiness, a desire to stop moving for a while. The problem, unfortunately, was that winter occasionally accepted the offer. The camp leader walks through once more carrying a lantern shielded beneath his coat. Snowflakes hiss softly against the glass. He pauses beside each fire, speaking quietly with travellers before moving onward through darkness again. No speeches, no grand confidence, just practical reminders. Keep the fire fed. Check the animals. Wake someone if conditions worsen. Trail survival often looked less heroic than modern stories prefer. More cooperative, more tired, more dependent on ordinary people refusing to give up small responsibilities. You stare into the fire until your eyes blur slightly from heat and smoke. Around you, conversations soften into murmurs beneath the steady wind. A baby cries briefly, then settles. Someone coughs hard into the darkness. Snow gathers along wagon wheels in pale ridges. The camp feels smaller now, fragile, like a handful of warm lights floating in an ocean of frozen emptiness. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, another realization settles quietly into your mind. This is only the beginning of the night. You finally climb into the wagon because your hands no longer feel entirely trustworthy. That becomes the deciding factor, not comfort, not confidence. Just the growing suspicion that if you remain outside much longer, your fingers may quietly resign from further responsibility. The wagon interior greets you with darkness, cramped space, and the smell of damp fabric trapped beneath cold canvas. Somehow it still feels better than the wind. Barely, you duck your head beneath the curved cover and pause while your eyes adjust. Supplies fill most of the available room: flour sacks, toolboxes, folded clothing wrapped in oilcloth. A crate that probably contained something fragile and deeply regretted by whoever insisted on bringing it west. Trail wagons carried extraordinary things sometimes. One emigrant famously packed an entire cast-iron stove across portions of the plains before eventually abandoning it beside the trail. Historians occasionally joke that the Oregon Trail functioned as the world's longest accidental yard sale. You can believe it! Right now, you would happily abandon nearly everything in exchange for central heating and a decent mattress. The wagon creaks softly around you while wind pushes against the canvas cover overhead. Snow rattles faintly across stretched fabric like handfuls of dry sand. You settle awkwardly beside bundled blankets and immediately discover another truth about trail life. Everything is either damp, frozen, uncomfortable, or all three simultaneously. A lantern glows dimly near the wagon opening, its light weak and amber through layers of blowing snow outside. Beyond it you glimpse moving shadows crossing camp. People still working, still checking ropes, still feeding fires. Nobody fully rests during storms. You pull a blanket across your knees and feel the rough scratch of wool against numb skin. It smells faintly of smoke and animal grease. Not pleasant exactly. Familiar, though. Familiarity becomes valuable surprisingly quickly. Outside, an ox snorts heavily. Harness chains clink together in the darkness. Then the sound fades beneath another long sweep of wind. You notice how alive the wagon feels. Not alive in a comforting sense. Alive in the sense that every gust makes wood groan and shift around you. Wheels settle deeper into frozen ground. Canvas snaps overhead. The entire structure complains constantly like an elderly ship trying very hard not to sink. Which honestly is fair. Prairie schooners looked romantic in paintings, but actual emigrant wagons were brutally practical vehicles designed for hauling supplies, not providing luxury travel accommodations. Many lacked springs entirely, meaning every rut, rock, and frozen patch of trail travelled directly through your spine with educational enthusiasm. You lean carefully against a crate and feel cold radiating upward through the wagon floor. That part surprises you, even sheltered from direct wind. The chill still climbs steadily from beneath. Cold does not respect boundaries out here. A lesser-known observation from emigrant diaries mentions that some travellers layered buffalo robes beneath sleeping areas, not merely for softness, but because the thick hides provided valuable insulation against frozen ground. Those robes could weigh astonishing amounts when wet. However, which turned moving them into a full-body argument with physics. Tonight several buffalo robes lie piled beside you, heavy and stiff around the edges where melting snow has frozen again. You pull one partially across your legs. Immediate improvement, still cold, of course, but now the cold feels farther away rather than directly negotiating ownership of your bones. Outside the wagon, voices drift softly through the storm. Someone laughs unexpectedly. The sound feels strange enough that you almost sit upright. Laughter survives remarkably well under difficult conditions. Sometimes because people remain hopeful, sometimes because the alternative feels too exhausting. You hear a man joking about how the wagon smells like wet dog and old onions. Another voice replies that this is deeply unfair to the dog. A few tired chuckles follow. Then the wind swallows everything again. You shift carefully to make room as another traveller climbs partly inside the wagon opening. Snow dust covers his shoulders white. He stomps his boots once before crouching beside the lantern. Storm's turning worse westward, he mutters. Not ideal news when west remains the only useful direction. He rubs his hands together briskly. The skin across his knuckles looks cracked and reddened from cold exposure. You notice everyone's hands eventually begin resembling unfinished woodworking projects out here. The lantern flickers, Its flame bends sharply sideways whenever wind slips through gaps in the canvas. Tiny currents of freezing air move constantly through the wagon interior, no matter how carefully coverings are arranged. This becomes another unpleasant discovery. Shelter on the Oregon Trail usually meant reducing suffering rather than eliminating it. A scholarly discussion still continues around how accurately later memoirs represented trail hardship. Some historians believe surviving emigrants occasionally emphasize suffering afterward to highlight personal endurance or justify sacrifices made during migration. Others argue many accounts actually understated conditions, because 19th century audiences already considered discomfort a normal feature of frontier life. Sitting here now with frozen boots, aching shoulders, and snow leaking through canvas seams, you strongly suspect understatement happened quite often. A child somewhere nearby begins coughing hard enough to echo through camp. The sound lingers uncomfortably long. Nobody comments. People simply listen quietly until it stops. You pull your coat tighter and attempt to flex warmth back into your toes. Mixed results. Your left foot responds reasonably well. The right appears emotionally unavailable. The storm presses harder against the wagon now. Snow taps rapidly overhead. Canvas ripples and strains in the darkness. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin understanding why emigrants feared nighttime blizzards so intensely. Daylight at least provided movement, tasks, distraction. But inside the wagon, trapped between darkness and weather, the mind grows louder. You think about distance. How far remains ahead? How far stretches behind? The trail suddenly feels impossibly large. Thousands of miles of rivers, plains, mountains, and weather indifferent to whether you survive crossing them. A strange frontier superstition occasionally appeared in emigrant journals involving abandoned wagon parts left beside the trail. Some travellers believed taking wood or supplies from deserted wagons invited bad luck, almost as though previous owners lingered invisibly beside their belongings. Whether anyone truly believed this or simply enjoyed dramatic storytelling after months of exhaustion remains uncertain. Still, you understand how quickly isolated landscapes create strange ideas. The wind outside rises into a low, steady roar now. No longer individual gusts, but continuous pressure against the camp. You hear footsteps crunch past the wagon. Someone checking animals again. Someone feeding another dying fire. Someone refusing sleep because responsibility matters more. The lantern light grows softer as fuel burns lower. Shadows deepen around stacked supplies until objects lose clear shapes in the dimness. You rest your head briefly against folded blankets. Instantly, the exhaustion hits harder. Not sudden exactly, just enormous. Your muscles ache with deep, heavy fatigue accumulated over endless days of travel. Even thinking feels slower tonight. Outside, snow continues burying the world inch by inch. Inside the wagon, warmth remains fragile and incomplete. But for now, at least, the canvas still stands between you and the storm. And for tonight, that counts as safety. The blankets feel heavier as the night deepens. Not physically heavier, although damp wool certainly tries its best. The weight comes from understanding that these layers of fabric now stand between your body and genuine danger. Every quilt, robe, shawl, and scrap of cloth suddenly carries importance far beyond comfort. You shift carefully inside the wagon, trying to arrange bedding without letting too much cold air inside your coat. It becomes an absurdly delicate operation. Lift one blanket and icy wind slips through another gap. Pull your boots off too soon and your toes begin reconsidering their long-term commitment to circulation. Frontier bedtime routines lacked elegance. You glance toward the wagon opening where lantern light still flickers weakly through blowing snow. The storm has settled into a steady rhythm now. Not violent exactly, relentless. Like listening to the ocean if the ocean wanted your ears to freeze off. Nearby, a woman wraps another layer around a sleeping child until only a tiny nose remains visible. The child squirms once, sighs softly, then disappears deeper into the blankets. You notice how carefully everyone watches sleeping people tonight. That vigilance mattered. A widely accepted historical reality is that emigrants often slept in shared warmth during extreme weather, especially children. Families crowded together beneath quilts and buffalo robes, not merely for emotional comfort, but because combined body heat significantly improves survival during freezing nights. Personal space becomes a very modern luxury out here. You tug a folded blanket beneath your shoulders and immediately discover a hidden lump underneath. Probably a cooking pan, or a tool handle. Or perhaps the Oregon Trail itself simply objects to spinal alignment on philosophical grounds. Either way, lying down requires negotiation. The buffalo robe over your legs smells strongly of animal hide and old smoke. Coarse fur brushes against your hands whenever you move, yet the robe traps warmth surprisingly well, enough that your knees stop aching quite so sharply from cold. Outside, someone shakes snow from canvas with a heavy thump, then another thump, then muttered swearing carried briefly through the wind. Some things remain timeless across centuries. You close your eyes for a moment, listening. Wagon wheels creak softly nearby. Harness chains rattle. Fires hiss under drifting snow. Oxen breathe in deep, slow rhythms beyond the camp, and underneath everything sits the constant whisper of snow touching canvas. It almost sounds peaceful. Almost. A curious trail detail recorded in several emigrant accounts involves people sleeping with heated bricks, stones, or even metal tools wrapped carefully in cloth near their feet. Success depended entirely on temperature, moisture, and whether someone accidentally transformed the bedding into a low-budget fire hazard. Human innovation often flourishes most enthusiastically under terrible circumstances. You rub your hands together beneath the blanket and notice the skin across your knuckles splitting slightly from dryness and cold. Tiny cuts sting sharply. Your lips feel cracked too. Winter strips moisture from everything. Wood, leather, skin, patience. The traveller beside the lantern quietly removes his boots with the expression of a man personally betrayed by footwear. Steam rises faintly from damp socks. That smell reaches you moments later. Powerful, historic, aggressively human. The Oregon Trail rarely appears in paintings smelling like wet feet, which honestly feels dishonest. He flexes stiff toes and mutters that one boot nearly froze solid earlier, crossing a shallow creek. You imagine icy water filling leather boots during snowfall and immediately appreciate your current misery more warmly. Outside the wagon, the camp has grown quieter. Most conversations now fade into low murmurs beneath the wind. People conserve energy instinctively after dark. Voices soften, movements slow. Even laughter becomes gentler somehow. Fatigue changes the shape of sound. Researchers continue discussing how emigrants psychologically adapted to prolonged hardship during westward migration. Some scholars emphasize resilience rooted in community cooperation and shared purpose. Others focus more heavily on emotional strain, loneliness, and cumulative exhaustion hidden beneath optimistic diary language. Listening to this camp tonight, you suspect endurance probably depended on both. People survived because they helped each other. People suffered because survival still hurt. The lantern flame dims lower, throwing long uneven shadows across stacked supplies. Every object inside the wagon seems softened by darkness now. Rounded edges, blurred corners. The storm outside no longer feels separate from the wagon. It surrounds everything completely. You pull another quilt higher across your chest. This one carries tiny faded stitching patterns along the edge. Red thread, blue thread, careful handmade lines created somewhere far east of here before the journey began. You wonder briefly who stitched it. A mother, a sister, someone sitting beside a warm fireplace months earlier, never fully imagining this moment on a frozen plain beneath endless snow. That thought settles strangely inside you. Many emigrants carried ordinary household objects west because those belongings represented continuity. Familiar quilts, dishes, books, or tools connected families to homes they had already left behind. Practical items mattered, certainly. But emotional comfort travelled too. Even now people cling to reminders of normal life. You hear quiet singing somewhere outside. Not performance singing, just someone humming softly while checking animals in the dark. The melody drifts through snow almost dreamlike before fading again. Your eyelids grow heavier. Exhaustion keeps returning in waves tonight. Every time you settle still for too long, sleep edges closer, yet the cold never fully allows relaxation. Your body remains half alert, aware of numb fingers, freezing air, shifting blankets. Trill sleep often existed in fragments. You turn carefully onto one side and feel the wagon floor press upward through layers of bedding. Hard wood beneath thin padding. Every bone in your body suddenly introduces itself individually. Comfort, apparently, stayed behind in Missouri. A strange rumour circulated among some wagon trains about people hearing phantom bells during blizzards. Tiny distant sleigh bells drifting across empty plains where no sleighs existed. Whether exhaustion caused auditory illusions or storytellers simply enjoyed unnerving each other after dark remains uncertain. Still, listening to the wind tonight, you understand how imagination could become unreliable. Snow changes perception. Darkness stretches distances strangely. Even time feels softer around the edges. You open your eyes briefly and watch frost slowly forming along the inside edge of the canvas cover. Tiny crystals spreading like pale veins through the fabric. The storm outside continues patiently burying the world. Inside the wagon, warmth gathers in fragile pockets beneath quilts and robes. Shared breath lingers faintly in the cold air. Bodies shift occasionally beneath blankets. Someone coughs once and settles again. You begin realizing something unexpectedly intimate about these nights. Blizzard stripped away privacy. Fear, pride, embarrassment. Everyone became equally vulnerable beneath the cold, and somehow, within that vulnerability, the camp grows quieter and closer together. The lantern finally dims to a faint amber glow. Beyond the canvas, the prairie disappears completely into snow and darkness. Inside, wrapped beneath layers of wool and buffalo hide, you wait for sleep to arrive carefully enough that morning still finds you there. Sometime deeper into the night, the fire outside begins losing the argument. You notice it gradually. The glow filtering through the wagon opening dims from bright orange to softer red. Shadows stretch farther across the snow. The crackling sound weakens until individual pops disappear beneath the wind. A dying campfire doesn't fail dramatically. It simply grows tired. You push yourself upright beneath the blankets and immediately regret the decision. Cold air rushes into every gap in your clothing with astonishing efficiency. Your knees ache, your shoulders protest. One side of your face is apparently frozen slightly against a folded blanket seam. Luxury travel, this is not. Outside the wagon, snow continues falling in steady silver lines beneath the darkness. The nearest fire pit now glows mostly with buried coals hidden beneath white ash and drifting snow. Two figures crouch beside it, feeding narrow pieces of wood into the fading heat. You recognize one of them as the older man who spent most of the evening glaring westward. He still looks unconvinced by the concept of mountains. The other traveller kneels low, blowing carefully across the coals until sparks rise briefly into the storm. Smoke curls sideways immediately, caught by the wind before it can climb properly upward. The smell reaches you moments later. Sharp smoke, wet wood, damp earth beneath melting snow, campfire smoke on the trail settled into everything eventually. Clothing, hair, blankets, food. Many emigrants later wrote that even after reaching settlements farther west, they could still smell smoke trapped in their belongings months later. Tonight the scent feels strangely reassuring. As long as something burns, people are still fighting the cold. You pull your coat tighter and climb partly out of the wagon. Snow crunches beneath your boots. The air feels sharper now than earlier, cold enough that each breath pinches faintly inside your nose. The firelight paints soft orange circles across nearby wagon wheels and bundled supplies. Beyond those little islands of warmth, darkness swallows everything whole. You kneel beside the fire pit while the older man shifts another log into place. "Wood's too wet," he mutters. True. But dry wood became increasingly difficult to find after storms. Travellers often gathered whatever fuel they could across the plains, including sagebrush, twisted roots, or dried buffalo dung. Romantic frontier paintings rarely mention the dung part, probably a marketing decision. Still, dried buffalo chips burn surprisingly well once properly lit. The older man pokes carefully at the coals with a stick blackened from previous fires. Tiny sparks spiral upward, vanish into snow, and disappear. Nobody wastes large pieces of wood tonight. Every scrap matters. An established historical detail from trail records shows that fuel shortages became serious concerns in many western regions, where trees were scarce. Travellers crossing open plains often learned quickly that maintaining fire through bad weather required planning, patience, and occasionally creative optimism. Mostly patience. You extend your hands toward the flames. Heat touches your skin lightly at first, barely enough to notice through numbness. Then sensation returns too quickly, bringing sharp, stinging pain to your fingertips. That unpleasant burning feeling means circulation is returning. Wonderful. Your body now punishes you for becoming warmer. The wind sweeps harder across camp, lifting loose snow into swirling shapes between the wagons. Canvas covers snap sharply overhead. Somewhere beyond the livestock line, a horse stamps repeatedly against frozen ground. Animals hate uncertainty almost as much as people do. You glance toward the dark prairie and see absolutely nothing beyond the nearest lantern glow. Snow and darkness have erased the horizon completely. It feels less like camping outdoors and more like floating inside a frozen cloud. One woman emerges briefly from another wagon carrying a small iron pot. She crouches beside the fire, holding the pot near the coals to thaw something inside. Probably water, or stew, or coffee thick enough to revive the dead and deeply disappoint them afterward. The fire hisses as snowflakes strike exposed embers. Steam rises briefly around the iron pot before vanishing into the wind. A peculiar frontier habit described in some emigrant memoirs involved people banking fires beneath ashes overnight to preserve hidden heat until morning. When conditions cooperated, buried coals could survive surprisingly long beneath insulating ash layers. When conditions did not cooperate, everyone woke miserable and angry beside a frozen pile of disappointment. Tonight the travellers clearly hope for the first outcome. You stare into the shifting flames long enough that time begins softening around the edges. Sleep deprivation does strange things during storms. Thoughts grow slower, movements more careful. Conversations drift apart halfway through sentences because nobody has enough energy left to complete them. The older man beside you finally speaks again. Storm like this keeps up, trail will vanish by morning. Nobody answers immediately, because everyone already knows. Snow-covered wagon ruts quickly across open country. Landmarks disappeared. Riverbanks change shape beneath drifting accumulation. In severe storms, emigrants sometimes waited days before attempting travel again, fearing animals or wagons would become lost in whiteout conditions. You imagine trying to navigate this landscape tomorrow if the snow deepens further. The thought settles heavily inside your chest. Academic discussions still continue over how much weather versus poor planning contributed to many trail disasters. Some historians emphasize unavoidable environmental conditions, while others point toward overloaded wagons, delayed departures, or risky decision-making by emigrant companies. Standing here tonight beside a failing fire, the distinction feels less important than modern people probably imagine. Coal does not particularly care why you arrived late. The flames rise briefly after another piece of wood catches. Warm orange light reflects across tired faces gathered near the fire pit. Everyone looks older by lantern glow. Even the younger travellers carry exhaustion around their eyes now. You hear low murmured conversation nearby about river crossings farther west, frozen banks, lost cattle, deep snow in the mountains ahead. Nobody raises their voice. Fear sounds quieter when people are tired. You rub your hands again and notice black soot collecting along your fingers from damp firewood. The smell of smoke clings heavily to your sleeves, and beneath all the discomfort, another realization slowly emerges. Firelight changes people during storms. Around daylight campfires, travelers work, cook, argue, repair equipment, but nighttime fires become something else entirely. Small circles of warmth holding back enormous darkness. Temporary islands against the weather. You watch sparks drift upward once more into falling snow. Tiny orange lights rising briefly before vanishing forever. The older man finally leans back from the fire and pulls his coat closer around his shoulders. The woman with the iron pot disappears into another wagon. Someone nearby coughs into the darkness again. One by one, conversations fade. The storm continues. The fire survives. Barely. And somewhere beyond the weak orange glow, the frozen prairie waits patiently for morning. The animals never truly sleep. That becomes obvious sometime after midnight, when the camp itself grows quieter but the livestock continue shifting restlessly through the storm. You hear them constantly once you begin listening properly. Hooves scraping frozen ground, harness rings clinking softly, heavy breathing rising through darkness in long cloudy bursts, an occasional impatient snort that sounds deeply judgmental of human decision-making, which, honestly, feels earned. You step carefully away from the fading fire and toward the livestock line with the lantern swinging low beside your leg. Snowflakes spin wildly through the light, appearing bright for an instant before dissolving again into darkness. The cold has changed character now. Earlier it felt sharp and energetic. Now it feels heavier, slower. Like the entire night has frozen into place around the camp. The oxen stand close together beneath drifting snow, huge pale shapes barely moving except for occasional tail flicks or slow turns of the head. Frost gathers along their backs and horns. Their hides steam faintly where body heat meets the freezing air. You reach one hand toward the nearest animal and feel rough, warm fur beneath a thin layer of melting snow. That warmth surprises you every time. A factual detail often forgotten in popular retellings of the Oregon Trail is how essential oxen truly were to overland travel. Despite horses receiving most of the romantic attention in paintings and films, oxen pulled the majority of emigrant wagons because they were stronger, cheaper, more reliable, and better suited for rough trail conditions. Less glamorous, far more useful. History, and unfortunately for movie directors, often favours practicality over elegance. The ox nearest you exhales loudly enough to fog your sleeve. Its dark eyes reflect lantern light for a moment before turning away again with visible emotional exhaustion. You understand immediately. The animal beside it shifts one massive hoof and rattles its chain softly. Snow has drifted halfway up the wagon wheels nearby. The storm moves steadily across camp now, no longer violent but persistent enough that nothing remains untouched for long. Further down the line, several horses stamp nervously against the ground. Horses react differently to weather than oxen, more alert, more anxious, more likely to behave as though the universe has personally offended them. One mule suddenly lets out a loud, irritated cry that echoes across the dark prairie. A baby wakes and starts crying in response. Somewhere else, another traveller groans tiredly. The mule, apparently satisfied with spreading misery equally, falls silent again. You pull your coat tighter and continue checking the tether lines. Leather straps feel stiff beneath your gloves. Ice has begun forming around several knots. Every task takes longer in freezing weather because your hands stop cooperating properly. That becomes one of the cruelest little details of winter travel. Even simple work grows difficult. A lesser-known trail observation appears in several emigrant journals describing how animals sometimes refuse frozen water, entirely unless ice was broken repeatedly throughout the night. Travellers often rose multiple times during storms just to ensure livestock could still drink. Keeping animals alive meant keeping yourself alive. Lose the oxen and the wagons stopped moving. Lose the wagons and survival became very uncertain very quickly. You pause beside a pair of mules wrapped loosely in rough blankets. Their ears twitch constantly at the sound of wind moving across the plains. One turns its head toward you, with an expression suggesting deep philosophical disappointment in westward expansion. Reasonable? You scratch gently along its neck anyway. The mule tolerates this with minimal enthusiasm. Snow continues collecting along your shoulders, while you work down the line, checking ropes and harnesses by lantern light. Every breath leaves white clouds drifting sideways into darkness. Nearby, two men quietly shovel snow away from feed sacks protected beneath canvas coverings. Their movements look slow from exhaustion. Nobody wastes conversation anymore unless necessary. Cold Steel's words first, then energy, then judgment. Researchers examining emigrant diaries still discuss how emotionally attached many families became to their animals during long migrations. Some accounts describe oxen and horses almost as fellow travellers rather than property, especially after months crossing difficult terrain together. Standing here tonight, that attachment makes perfect sense. The animals suffer beside you, endure beside you, wait beside you. One horse nudges your shoulder unexpectedly while searching for feed. Warm breath rolls across your sleeve, carrying the scent of hay and damp hide. For a brief second, the contact feels comforting enough that you nearly laugh. Then the horse attempts to chew part of your coat. History remains balanced. You move farther from the firelight and immediately notice how enormous the darkness has become. The camp behind you glows faintly through falling snow. Tiny orange lanterns, dim firelight, soft moving shadows. Beyond that small circle of warmth lies only white wind and endless prairie. A curious frontier rumour occasionally surfaced among emigrants, claiming animals could sense death or disaster before storms fully arrived. Horses refusing trails, oxen becoming restless, dogs whining toward darkness for no visible reason. Whether these stories reflected genuine behavioural observations or simply exhausted humans searching desperately for patterns remains uncertain. Still, listening to the uneasy shifting of livestock tonight, you understand how such beliefs survived. Animals notice things people miss. A sudden gust sweeps hard across camp, driving snow against your face sharply enough to sting. One lantern flickers dangerously low before recovering. The horses react immediately, stamping and pulling lightly at their tethers. You soothe them automatically despite having no real idea what you're doing. This seems surprisingly common on the Oregon Trail. Many emigrants learned skills through immediate necessity rather than expertise. People became wagon repairers, livestock handlers, weather observers, and wilderness travellers because conditions demanded adaptation whether they felt qualified or not. The prairie did not issue certifications. The oxen remain calmer than the horses. They simply lower their heads farther against the wind and continue existing with ancient patient stubbornness. Honestly, there is something admirable about that. You hear another traveller approaching through the snow carrying an armful of extra feed. Neither of you speaks much while scattering grain and hay beneath partial shelter. The sound alone changes the mood instantly. Crunching, chewing, steady animal breathing, life continuing. The traveller finally mutters that the storm may ease near dawn if the wind shifts northward. Or worsen, weather predictions on the trail often contained approximately the same scientific precision as reading emotional meaning into soup patterns. Still, people guessed anyway. You take one final look across the livestock line before turning back toward the wagons. Snow clings thickly to blankets draped over mule backs. Lantern light flickers softly across frost-covered harnesses. Oxen breathe slow clouds into darkness. The entire camp feels suspended between movement and stillness, waiting for morning, waiting for clearer skies, waiting to discover what the storm intends to leave behind when it finally passes. The The smell of supper returns before you fully realize how hungry you are again. It drifts through camp slowly, tangled with smoke and snow, salt pork simmering somewhere over weak coals, beans thickening inside iron pots, burnt flour from rough trail bread cooked too quickly, because everyone wants warmth more than perfection. Under ordinary circumstances, this meal would probably disappoint you deeply. Tonight it feels almost luxurious. You crouch beside one of the smaller fires where several travellers huddle beneath blankets and heavy coats. The flames burn low and stubborn, protected by a rough ring of stones now half buried beneath snow. An iron pot hangs crookedly above the coals, bubbling softly. Every few moments someone leans forward to stir it, partly to prevent burning and partly because movement keeps fingers alive. That becomes another truth of winter camp life. Stillness is dangerous. A commonly accepted historical fact about overland migration is that trail food became increasingly repetitive the farther west travellers moved. Basic staples like flour, bacon, beans, coffee, dried fruit, and hard biscuits formed the foundation of many emigrant diets. Fresh food appeared occasionally through hunting or trading, but blizzards reduced those possibilities quickly. Tonight the stew contains mostly beans and determination. You accept a tin bowl carefully, grateful for the heat radiating through the metal. Steam rises across your face carrying the scent of salt, grease, and wood smoke. The first bite nearly burns your tongue. Worth it. You sit on an overturned bucket near the fire while snowflakes drift lazily through the orange glow around camp. The bowl warms your hands better than the fire itself. Everyone eats slowly tonight, partly from exhaustion and partly because hot food disappears too quickly otherwise. Nobody wastes heat. Across from you, a woman tears pieces from a dense biscuit and drops them into her stew to soften. Beside her, 2 children lean sleepily against bundled blankets while trying not to spill supper into their laps. One of them yawns so dramatically it nearly becomes a medical emergency. The other stares into the fire with a strange solemnity children sometimes develop under difficult conditions. You notice how quiet meals become during storms. No lively storytelling tonight. No arguments. Just spoons scraping tin bowls and occasional soft murmurs beneath the wind. A curious detail from trail diaries mentions emigrants sometimes craving extremely specific foods during harsh weather. Fresh milk, apples, pickles, warm bread with butter. One traveller reportedly described dreaming about onions for weeks during a difficult crossing. The human brain, under stress, apparently transforms grocery lists into emotional poetry. Right now you would commit morally questionable acts for a decent potato. The fire snaps softly, scattering sparks upward into the snowfall. Tiny orange lights rise briefly before vanishing into darkness. You glance toward the nearest wagon, where frost gathers thickly along the canvas edges. Snow has begun piling against the wheels in uneven drifts. The entire camp looks smaller now than earlier in the evening, shrunken by weather. A man near the fire quietly mentions hearing that another wagon train farther south lost several cattle during an early storm crossing. Nobody reacts dramatically. Trail rumours travelled constantly, especially during bad weather. Some true, some exaggerated, some probably invented by exhausted people needing conversation. Specialists studying emigrant letters continue debating how accurately trail travellers understood nutritional health. Many emigrants recognize the importance of calories and preserving food supplies, but scientific understanding of vitamins and deficiency illnesses remained limited. People knew weakness followed poor diet. They simply lacked modern explanations for why. You look into your bowl again. Beans, grease, a few tiny scraps of salt pork floating near the surface. Not elegant nutrition, but enough, hopefully, to keep the body producing warmth another night. The wind shifts suddenly, blowing smoke directly into the circle around the fire. Everyone turns away at once, coughing and blinking through stinging eyes. The fire apparently resents criticism. One of the older travellers pulls a coffee pot closer to the coals and checks the contents with grim concentration. Trail coffee often resembled an experiment in controlled bitterness. Grounds boiled repeatedly until flavour became less important than temperature and caffeine. Yet emigrants adored it. Honestly, so would you? He pours carefully into several tin cups. The liquid looks dark enough to absorb nearby light. You accept one gratefully. The coffee tastes burnt, smoky, and vaguely metallic from the cup. Warmth spreads slowly through your chest anyway. Miracle beverage. Nearby, a younger man jokes quietly that if the coffee grows any stronger, it may start pulling the wagons itself tomorrow. A few tired laughs circle the fire. Even exhausted humour helps. Researchers sometimes note that communal eating played an important emotional role during difficult stretches of the Oregon Trail. Shared meals created temporary moments of normalcy and cooperation amid uncertainty. Sitting together around weak fires reminded people they remained part of a group rather than isolated individuals fighting weather alone. You feel that now. The camp still suffers, the storm still deepens, but here beside the fire, holding hot coffee between frozen hands, the darkness feels slightly less enormous. A woman unwraps a small cloth bundle beside you and reveals several preserved apple slices carefully saved from earlier weeks of travel. The children stare with open amazement as she passes tiny pieces round the circle. One slice reaches you eventually. Sweetness explodes across your tongue so unexpectedly that you nearly laugh aloud. Amazing what qualifies as luxury after enough hardship. A strange frontier belief occasionally surfaced among emigrants that eating snow directly increased illness or weakness. While packed snow could certainly lower body temperature dangerously, many travellers still consumed it when water supplies froze or access became difficult. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to ignore sensible advice when thirsty enough. Outside the firelight, the oxen continue shifting softly through the darkness. You hear chains clink and low animal breathing beyond the storm. The world beyond camp remains invisible. Just snow, wind, night. You finished the last spoonful of stew slowly, scraping warmth from the bottom of the bowl. Around you, people begin wrapping blankets tighter and preparing to retreat beneath wagon cover again. Nobody wants to leave the fire. Everyone eventually must. The flames burn lower now as fuel dwindles once more. Smoke drifts flat across the camp beneath the weight of cold air. You take one final sip of coffee before standing carefully, knees stiff from cold and fatigue. Somewhere overhead, hidden completely beyond clouds and snowfall, the stars continue their silent movement westward. But down here beside the dying fire, time feels frozen in place. The children begin disappearing beneath blankets one by one. Not literally, thankfully. Though with enough quilts piled together, it becomes difficult to tell where one small body ends and another begins. Little bundles of wool and buffalo hide line the wagon interiors now, tucked beside crates and supply sacks like carefully protected cargo. In many ways, they are the most precious cargo on the trail. You crouch beside one wagon where a mother adjusts layers around a sleeping infant wrapped so thoroughly only a tiny forehead remains visible. Her movements are slow from exhaustion, but precise from practice. Pull blanket higher, check hands, tuck edges tighter against drifting air. Repeat, again and again through the night. The baby stirs faintly, making small sleepy sounds before settling once more beneath the warmth. You notice how adults speak differently around children during storms. Softer voices, smaller smiles, calm expressions carefully arranged even when worry lingers visibly underneath. Fear becomes something people try to hide. A well-documented historical reality is that families with children made up a significant portion of Oregon Trail emigrants. Despite popular images focusing on rugged young adventurers, many wagon trains included infants, toddlers, elderly relatives, and pregnant women enduring the same harsh conditions together, which feels mildly unbelievable once you stand here in the snow. Modern parents panic when toddlers lick shopping carts. These people crossed mountain ranges during blizzards in canvas wagons. Human resilience truly operates on disturbing levels sometimes. You step carefully between wagons while snow whispers steadily around camp. Somewhere nearby, a little boy refuses sleep with the determined outrage only exhausted children can produce. "I ain't tired." He says this while actively falling sideways against a blanket roll. His father catches him gently before he hits the wagon wall. The entire exchange lasts perhaps 10 seconds. Then the boy is asleep. Honestly impressive efficiency. The father pulls another quilt over him and glances toward the storm outside. For a moment, firelight catches the exhaustion across his face sharply enough that he suddenly appears much older than earlier in the evening. Winter nights aged people quickly. A rarely mentioned frontier detail appears in some emigrant recollections involving mothers warming stones near fires before wrapping them inside cloth and placing them near children's feet during storms. It required careful attention because overheated stones could scorch bedding or crack unexpectedly. Still, parents kept trying anything that might preserve warmth. You duck beneath another wagon cover where two sisters already sleep pressed tightly together beneath layered blankets. Their cheeks glow pink from heat trapped inside the wagon. One clutches a rag doll against her chest despite the cramped conditions. The doll itself looks exhausted. Beside them, an older woman quietly knits by weak lantern light while listening to the storm. Her needles click softly in steady rhythm. Tiny metallic sounds. Tiny motions, tiny acts of normal life continuing inside the blizzard. You ask quietly why she still bothers knitting this late. "Hands stiffen if I stop," she replies. Then after a pause, "And children sleep easier hearing familiar sounds." That answer stays with you. Researchers examining emigrant family life frequently note how routines helped preserve emotional stability during difficult travel conditions. Familiar habits like storytelling, sewing, prayer, cooking, or singing created psychological continuity even when the surrounding world felt chaotic and uncertain. The storm outside continues roaring softly against the wagon canvas. Inside, knitting needles keep clicking. You realize then how much of frontier survival depended not merely on endurance, but on preserving ordinary human rhythms wherever possible. One child coughs sharply from beneath the blankets nearby. Instantly, 3 adults glance over. The cough stops. Everyone relaxes slightly without speaking. Illness haunted wagon trains constantly. Fever, dysentery, cholera, respiratory infections. Cold weather intensified every concern because weakness and exposure fed each other mercilessly. Even tonight, with the storm dominating attention, people still listen carefully for signs of sickness in the dark. You move back outside and nearly lose your hat immediately to the wind. Snow drives sideways across camp in pale streaks beneath lantern glow. The fires burn lower now, reduced mostly to red coals beneath drifting ash. The cold feels deeper than before. Quieter too. You hear soft humming from one wagon where someone tries lulling a restless child back to sleep. The melody drifts faintly through canvas and snowfall, almost impossible to follow clearly. Still comforting. A curious anecdote recorded in one emigrant memoir described children on the trail collecting oddly shaped stones, feathers, or bits of metal during difficult journeys and treating them as treasured possessions. Historians are unsure how widespread the practice truly was, but it reflects something recognizable about childhood. Even in hardship, children still searched for small wonders. You glance toward a wagon wheel, partly buried in snow, where tiny footprints circle around the camp from earlier in the evening, evidence that children were still here beneath all this cold, still playing, still exploring, still somehow adapting faster than adults often managed. The wind gusts harder again. Canvas flaps crack sharply overhead. One lantern nearly extinguishes before steadying once more. Inside another wagon, a woman quietly tells a story to several children already half asleep beneath blankets. You catch fragments only. Something about rivers, something about a farm back east, something about spring eventually returning. The children do not answer. They are already drifting towards sleep. You stand listening a moment longer anyway. Academic discussions continue around how emigrant children emotionally processed overland migration. Some surviving accounts describe excitement and adventure. Others hint at fear, boredom, grief, or confusion hidden beneath adult narratives focused on progress and determination. Probably all were true depending on the child. Tonight, though, exhaustion seems stronger than fear. The storm has worn everyone down evenly. You return toward your own wagon slowly through deepening snow. Around you, camp settles into uneasy rest. Adults whisper quietly while checking blankets one last time. Boots dry badly beside fading fires. Oxen breathe steadily beyond the wagons. And everywhere beneath the storm, children sleep, wrapped in quilts stitched far away, sheltered beneath canvas walls thin as paper against winter, dreaming perhaps of warmer places they barely remember now. The snow continues falling patiently over the prairie, but inside the little islands of wagon light, families hold tightly to one another while the long, frozen night carries on around them. You're awake again before you fully understand why. For a moment you lie motionless beneath the blankets, listening to the wagon creak softly around you while snow brushes against the canvas overhead. The darkness inside feels thick and close. Shared breathing fills the cramped space in slow, uneven rhythms. Then you hear it, a low voice outside the wagon. Your turn. You close your eyes briefly in silent protest against responsibility. The blankets have finally become warm. Your hands no longer ache quite so badly. One corner of your body has almost reached comfort, which on the Oregon Trail qualifies as a spiritual event. Unfortunately, the night watch still needs changing. You push yourself upright with all the grace of an elderly fence post and pull your coat back on. The cold waiting outside the blankets feels immediate and personal. Nobody enjoys night watch duty. That is exactly why it matters. A practical reality of emigrant travel involved maintaining rotating watches during difficult weather or uncertain conditions. Someone needed to monitor fires, animals, equipment, drifting snow, and potential emergencies throughout the night. Sleep happened in fragments because safety required constant attention. You step out into the storm carrying a lantern shielded beneath your coat. The cold hits instantly. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just complete. Your breath fogs heavily before being torn sideways by the wind. Snow crunches beneath your boots in fresh, deep layers. The camp appears transformed from earlier in the evening, softer and stranger beneath accumulating drifts. Wagons resemble half-buried shapes from another world now. Canvas covers glow faintly where lantern light escapes through seams. Snow piles along wheel spokes and wagon tongues. The fires survive mostly as low red pockets hidden beneath ash. Everything feels muted. Even your own footsteps sound distant somehow. The man ending his watch stands beside the nearest fire, rubbing stiff hands together. Frost clings heavily to his beard. When shifted north, he mutters quietly, "Keep an eye on the horses." Then he disappears toward a wagon without further conversation. You understand immediately. Nobody wastes extra words at this hour. You crouch beside the fire first, stirring buried coals carefully with a stick until faint orange light brightens beneath the ash. Tiny sparks drift upward into the dark snowfall. The warmth barely reaches your face, still enough. A strange but genuine detail from some trail recollections describes emigrants using coffee not merely as a beverage during watches, but almost as ritual. A hot tin cup passed between tired hands became reassurance that another human remained awake beside you in the dark. Tonight no coffee waits, only snow and silence. You stand again and move slowly through camp, checking lanterns one by one. Most burn low now, tiny trembling lights surrounded by frozen darkness. You shield one flame from the wind while adjusting the wick lower to preserve oil. The lantern glass feels bitterly cold against your fingers. Beyond the wagons, the livestock shift uneasily. You head toward them next. Snow reaches nearly to your ankles now. Drifts gather thickly along the sheltered sides of wagons. Somewhere beneath all that white lies muddy prairie grass and frozen ground. Though the landscape no longer resembles anything familiar, the night has erased distance completely. You could believe the world extends no farther than this camp. The oxen remain mostly calm, great dark shapes breathing steam into the storm. One lifts its head as you approach, ears twitching beneath gathered frost. The horses react more nervously. One stamps repeatedly against packed snow, while another pulls lightly at its tether rope. You move carefully between them, speaking softly despite having no confidence whatsoever in your ability to calm horses. Fortunately, they seem too tired to judge your technique harshly. Studies of emigrant camp routines continue examining how responsibilities were divided during trail travel. While leadership roles existed, survival often depended on shared labor distributed across families and traveling groups. Night watchers especially required cooperation because exhaustion could become dangerous remarkably quickly. You understand that now. Standing here half frozen in blowing snow, you realize no single person could manage this camp alone. The prairie humbles individualism very efficiently. A gust sweeps hard across the livestock line, carrying loose snow against your face sharply enough to sting. The horses shift again, snorting clouds into the darkness. Then suddenly one mule lets out a loud irritated bray directly beside you. You nearly throw the lantern. The mule watches calmly afterward with the emotional satisfaction of a creature that has improved its evening significantly. You stare at it. The mule stares back. An important frontier relationship unfolds. Further down the line, you notice snow collecting heavily against several feed sacks beneath their canvas cover. You stop to brush the accumulation away before the weight freezes harder. Small tasks. Always small tasks. The night watch mostly consists of preventing little problems from becoming enormous ones by morning. You return slowly toward the center of camp. Around you, sleeping wagons glow dimly beneath snow-coated canvas. Occasionally someone coughs from inside. Occasionally a child murmurs in sleep. The sounds feel strangely intimate beneath the storm. You realize how exposed everyone truly is. Thin fabric, weak fires, tired bodies. That is the entire defense against winter tonight. A peculiar frontier superstition occasionally mentioned in trail accounts involved travelers believing certain storms carried unnatural silence before disaster. If animals stopped moving, if wind dropped suddenly, if the prairie became too quiet. Exhausted minds often interpreted ordinary weather changes as warnings. You understand how that happened. Snow changes the emotional texture of sound itself. Even now the camp feels suspended in a strange muffled stillness. The fire nearest you burns lower again. You kneel carefully to feed another piece of wood into the coals and watch flames slowly climb upward through drifting smoke. Orange light spreads across the snow around your boots. For a few minutes, the world becomes simple. Keep the fire alive. Keep the animals secure. Stay awake. The wind eases slightly sometime later, though snow continues falling steadily through the darkness. You tilt your head upward and catch flakes against your face. No stars visible. No moon. Just endless pale motion descending from unseen clouds. Historians continue discussing how emigrants mentally measured progress during difficult crossings. Miles mattered, certainly, but so did surviving nights like this one. Endurance itself became a form of achievement. Wake up, preserve the wagons, keep moving westward when morning finally arrived. That counted as success. You glance once more across the sleeping camp. Tiny lanterns, snow-covered wheels, low fires breathing faint warmth into the frozen air, and you standing watch beneath the storm, waiting patiently for dawn to remember the world again. The longer you remain awake in the storm, the more sounds begin separating themselves from the darkness. At first the blizzard felt like one endless noise, wind and snow blending together into a single frozen roar around the wagons. But now, standing beside the half-buried fire with exhaustion, sharpening your attention strangely, you start noticing individual layers hidden underneath. Canvas snapping overhead, ice crackling along wagon rims, a soft grind of snow drifting against wood, a horse chewing slowly somewhere beyond the lantern light. The prairie has become an orchestra entirely dedicated to discomfort. You pull your scarf higher against the cold and listen carefully while feeding another narrow branch into the fire. Flames crawl upward reluctantly through damp wood, releasing thick smoke that drifts low across camp before disappearing into the storm. The smoke smells different now than earlier in the evening. Heavier, sharper, like the fire itself has grown tired. A widely recognised fact about overland travel is that sound carried strangely across the plains depending on weather conditions. Emigrants frequently described hearing distant wagon trains, animal calls, thunder, or human voices travelling unexpectedly far across open country. Snowstorms, however, often transformed sound entirely by muffling distance and swallowing echoes. Tonight the storm makes everything feel both close and impossibly far away at once. You hear footsteps approaching through the drifts before you actually see anyone. Slow crunching, uneven rhythm, someone fighting fatigue more than snow. The older woman with the knitting needles emerges from darkness carrying a small bundle of sticks beneath one arm. "Found dry pieces under the wagon bed," she says softly. You take several pieces gratefully and feed them into the coals. The fire responds immediately, brightening with visible relief. Honestly, same. Orange light spills across nearby snowbanks, revealing tiny glittering crystals drifting endlessly through the air. The wind has eased slightly compared to earlier, though the snowfall continues without pause. The camp almost looks peaceful now, until you really listen. From one wagon comes the low, steady cough you heard earlier. Deeper now, wet-sounding, not severe perhaps, but enough that several nearby travellers glance instinctively toward the noise whenever it returns. Elsewhere a baby whimpers briefly before settling again. Harness rings clink softly as oxen shift their weight against frozen ground. A wagon axle creaks. Leather straps flap. Snow whispers against canvas in endless repetition. You begin understanding how trail travellers memorize nighttime sounds so carefully. Each one meant something. A peculiar detail preserved in some emigrant recollections involves experienced teamsters recognizing individual animals purely by sound during darkness. Certain oxen snorted differently. Particular horses pawed the ground with recognizable rhythms. In crowded camps, that familiarity became surprisingly useful. You suspect people also memorized noises because the alternative felt unnerving. Unknown sounds grow larger in storms. You move slowly through camp again, checking lanterns and fire pits. Snow reaches nearly halfway up your boots now. Drifts gather in smooth curved shapes along wagon wheels and supply crates. One lantern has gone out completely. You relight it carefully while shielding the match beneath your coat. Sulphur briefly fills the air with its sharp, bitter scent before the lantern wick catches. Tiny victory. The lantern glows softly against the darkness once more. Somewhere beyond the camp, hidden completely by snowfall, you hear what might be a coyote, or wind, or imagination growing overconfident from lack of sleep. Experts still disagree about how isolated emigrants truly felt during severe weather crossings. Some diaries describe overwhelming loneliness on the plains, while others emphasize strong communal bonds within wagon companies. The emotional experience likely shifted constantly depending on conditions, personalities, and simple exhaustion. Standing here tonight, you feel both sensations at once. The camp itself feels close. The world beyond it feels endless. You pause beside the livestock line again. The animals have grown quieter during the last hour. Oxen stand nearly motionless beneath their coating of snow. Horses lower their heads against the cold. Only the occasional heavy breath disturbs the stillness. Steam rises from their nostrils in pale, ghostly clouds. You hear another sound then. Very faint, snow sliding gradually from a wagon cover somewhere behind you. A soft rushing collapse. You turn instinctively toward it. Nothing dramatic follows. Just one traveller stepping out sleepily to brush accumulated snow away before the weight grows heavier. Still, your heart beats faster briefly afterward. The night keeps reminding everyone how fragile things are. Another gust passes across the camp carrying a mixture of scents with it. Wood smoke, wet leather, animal fur, coffee grounds tossed beside a fire earlier in the evening, and underneath all of it, cold itself somehow has a smell too. Clean, sharp, empty. You return toward the fire once more and crouch beside the glowing coals. The warmth barely touches your face before the wind steals most of it away again. Fatigue presses harder now. Your thoughts move slowly, drifting apart mid-sentence inside your own head. You stare into the fire long enough that the glowing embers begin resembling tiny distant cities beneath the ash. Sleep deprivation and firelight form a dangerous artistic partnership. A curious trail superstition occasionally mentioned in personal journals claimed hearing your name called in storms was a warning never to answer aloud. Some travellers blamed exhaustion for auditory tricks caused by wind crossing open country. Others preferred more mysterious explanations. Tonight you almost understand how that belief survived. The storm plays strange games with sound. Several times already you've turned your head convinced someone spoke nearby, only to find drifting snow and darkness waiting quietly instead. You pull your coat tighter and glance upward. Still no stars. The clouds remain thick and low, trapping the entire camp beneath a ceiling of moving white darkness. Snowflakes drift through lantern-light continuously, hypnotic in their endless descent. The fire crackles softly again after another branch catches. A horse snorts. A child murmurs in sleep. Canvas ripples overhead. These little noises become reassuring after enough hours awake. Proof the camp still exists. Proof people are still breathing beneath the blankets. Proof the storm has not swallowed everything completely. You sit there listening while the long frozen night stretches onward across the prairie, and somewhere beyond the drifting snow, hidden from sight but slowly approaching all the same, dawn continues making its patient way toward the camp. Toward the darkest part of the night, you begin thinking about the trail itself, not the idea of it. The actual trail, where exactly it is beneath all this snow. You stand beside the wagon line, staring outward into pale darkness, trying to imagine the rutted road that brought everyone here. Earlier in the day, the wagon track stretched visibly across the prairie like rough scars pressed into frozen earth. Now they are gone, completely erased. Snow has smoothed the land into something blank and uncertain. That realization settles into the camp gradually, passing from person to person without needing to be spoken aloud. By morning, nobody may know exactly where the route continues westward, and that possibility frightens people more than they admit. A factual detail noted by many emigrants is that trail visibility could disappear astonishingly fast during winter storms, especially across open plains and high mountain crossings. Wagon ruts that seemed obvious during clear weather vanished beneath drifting snow within hours, forcing travellers to rely on landmarks, guides, river directions, or pure uncertain instinct, which feels significantly less heroic when standing inside the actual blizzard. You pull your coat tighter and glance toward the dark horizon again. Nothing. No hills visible. No stars. No distant landmarks. Just endless moving white. The fire behind you crackles softly while snow gathers along the shoulders of your coat. Several travellers have emerged from their wagons despite the hour, drawn awake by worry rather than noise. One man squints into the storm as though determination alone might reveal the hidden road. Another quietly brushes snow from a buried wheel hub for the third time tonight. Small repetitive tasks become emotional anchors during uncertainty. You hear someone mutter that if snowfall deepens much further, they may need scouts at first light. Nobody answers immediately. Scouting ahead during blizzard conditions carried obvious risks. People became disoriented quickly on the plains, especially after exhaustion blurred judgment and distance perception. A traveller could wander surprisingly far from camp without realizing it, and then not find the way back. You think about that longer than you want to. A lesser-known emigrant practice involved using tall grass bundles, cloth markers, or even dragged chains behind wagons to preserve visible tracks through fresh snow when storms threatened. Success depended heavily on wind conditions. The prairie, unfortunately, enjoyed ignoring human planning whenever possible. Tonight the prairie appears fully committed to chaos. You crouch beside the weak fire while another traveller pours coffee grounds into boiling water with the solemn focus of a frontier chemist. The resulting liquid will almost certainly taste like burnt fence posts, yet everyone nearby watches hopefully. The coffee pot steams softly in the cold air. Smoke drifts low across the camp, carrying the familiar sense of ash, wet leather, and exhausted humanity. You accept a cup once it is ready. The heat nearly hurts your hands. Perfect. Nearby, two men quietly discuss river crossings farther ahead on the trail. One claims snowstorms can completely disguise frozen banks until wagons practically slide into them. The other insists experienced guides can still recognize river routes by tree patterns and wind direction. Both sound unconvinced by their own expertise. Modern historians continue examining how emigrants navigated uncertain terrain under severe weather conditions. Some emphasize the importance of professional guides and established landmarks, while others note how often wagon companies depended on collective memory, rumour, incomplete maps, or improvised decision-making, which honestly explains a lot about frontier anxiety. You sip the bitter coffee slowly and stare outward again. The world beyond the firelight feels erased. That is the unsettling part. Not merely hidden, removed. Snow transforms familiar land into something entirely unfamiliar. Distances shrink and expand unpredictably. Directions lose confidence. Even sound changes shape beneath heavy weather. You suddenly understand why trail travellers feared becoming lost so deeply. Out here, confusion could become fatal quietly. A curious story circulated among several wagon companies about emigrants who accidentally followed old animal paths or abandoned wagon traces for miles during storms before realizing they had drifted far from the true route westward. Some versions of the story ended harmlessly. Others became warnings whispered beside campfires. Nobody entirely knew which versions were true anymore. The snow keeps falling. Steady. Patient. You move slowly toward the edge of camp until the nearest lantern glow weakens behind you. Immediately the darkness changes. The storm feels larger away from the wagons. Colder somehow. You stop after only a short distance. Already the camp behind you looks strangely fragile. Small lantern lights flickering through drifting snow. Tiny islands of warmth surrounded by endless frozen emptiness. Your chest tightens unexpectedly. You return toward the wagons at once. The prairie teaches humility very efficiently at night. A horse snorts softly as you pass the livestock line again. Frost sparkles pale across the animals' backs beneath lantern light. Snowdrifts gather around their legs now. The oxen continue enduring the storm with quiet prehistoric patience. You envy them slightly. Animals at least do not worry about maps. Inside one wagon, a child wakes briefly and asks whether morning is close yet. The mother answers yes automatically, though her voice carries the uncertain softness of someone who has stopped trusting time. You realize you have no idea what hour it is anymore. Only darkness, only cold, only waiting. Researchers studying emigrant diaries occasionally point out how weather altered emotional perceptions of distance and progress. During storms, even short stretches of trail could begin feeling psychologically enormous. Travelers trapped by snow often described sensations of stagnation, isolation, or helplessness far beyond the physical delay itself. You feel that now standing beside the buried wagon wheels, westward movement has stopped completely tonight. The trail no longer leads anywhere visible, and still, everyone remains pointed toward Oregon as though direction alone might preserve hope. The coffee grows colder in your hands. You finish the last bitter mouthful and set the empty tin cup beside the fire. Somewhere beyond the snowfall lies the road west. Somewhere beyond the mountains lies green land, warmer valleys, rivers not yet frozen solid. At least that is what people keep telling themselves. For now, though, the storm owns the prairie entirely, and the camp waits motionless beneath the snow, listening for the first faint signs that morning may eventually find the trail again. The wetness becomes impossible to ignore sometime before dawn. Cold alone is exhausting. Wet cold feels invasive. It creeps steadily through fabric, settles into seams, and stays there stubbornly no matter how tightly blankets are wrapped around you. You notice it first in your boots. The leather has stiffened from snow and repeated thawing beside weak fires. Every step now produces a faint cracking sound around the soles. Inside, your socks feel damp enough that your toes never fully warm again no matter how long you stand near the coals. You flex them anyway. Minimal success. Nearby, another traveller sits beside a lantern trying to dry gloves over a tiny pocket of heat. Steam rises faintly from the wool before the gloves cool again almost immediately. That cycle repeats endlessly tonight. Warm, damp, freeze, repeat. An established truth recorded in many emigrant journals is that moisture caused some of the worst misery during overland winters. Snow melting into boots, blankets absorbing condensation, and clothing freezing stiff overnight created constant physical discomfort even when travellers avoided outright frostbite. Dryness became a luxury. You crouch beside the fire and hold your hands toward the weak flames. The skin along your knuckles looks rough and pale beneath soot stains. Tiny cracks burn sharply whenever warmth returns too quickly. Around you, camp smells increasingly of damp wool and smoke. That scent now saturates everything. Canvas, hair, blankets. Even food seems faintly flavoured by ash and wet leather. A younger woman nearby wrings melted snow from the edge of a shawl before draping it closer to the coals. She watches the fabric anxiously, careful not to scorch it. One damaged piece of clothing could become serious trouble during continued cold. People guard fabric almost as carefully as food out here. You glance toward the wagon interiors where blankets hang awkwardly from ropes and wheel spokes in desperate attempts to dry before morning travel. Most remain damp regardless. The prairie appears determined to own every piece of cloth in camp eventually. A curious frontier practice occasionally mentioned in diaries involved travellers rubbing snow directly onto muddy clothing before brushing it away once frozen. Under certain conditions, it actually helped remove dirt without soaking fabric further. Under other conditions, it mostly produced colder laundry and regret. Human experimentation continued enthusiastically across the trail. The fire pops softly beside you. Someone coughs again from inside one of the wagons. Another traveller mutters in sleep beneath heavy blankets. Beyond the camp, the wind has eased somewhat, though snow still drifts steadily across the prairie. You notice frost forming along the edges of several coats hanging near the flames. Even the drying process freezes. A modern person might reasonably ask why emigrants did not simply carry more spare clothing. The answer, unfortunately, involves physics and wagon weight. Every additional item meant more strain on animals and equipment. Travellers constantly balanced comfort against practicality, often sacrificing luxury long before necessity truly demanded it, which explains why so many people out here own exactly one respectable pair of socks and a deeply complicated relationship with them. You pull one boot partly off and inspect the damage. Your sock feels clammy and cold against swollen skin. Not dangerous yet, but enough to make you deeply appreciate 20th century waterproof materials. You tug the boot back on quickly before losing what little warmth remains. Nearby, an older man slowly massages circulation back into his fingers while staring into the fire. His beard carries tiny frozen droplets where melted snow has refrozen around the edges. Nobody looks entirely comfortable anymore. That stage passed hours ago. Researchers continue discussing how emigrants adapted physically to prolonged environmental stress during westward migration. Some accounts suggest travellers gradually developed greater tolerance for discomfort after months on the trail. Others imply exhaustion simply altered expectations until misery felt normal. Sitting here in damp boots before dawn, you suspect normalization played a major role. The human mind adjusts disturbingly well to hardship if alternatives disappear long enough. Another traveller steps from a wagon carrying frozen clothing stiff as boards. He attempts to shake out a shirt and nearly injures himself with it. The shirt, apparently, now possesses structural integrity. A few tired laughs circle the fire. Humour survives surprisingly well in bad conditions. The man eventually hangs the shirt beside the flames, where it slowly softens enough to resemble fabric again rather than defensive armour. Snow continues drifting quietly through the camp while lanterns burn low and amber beneath the remaining darkness. You hear soft scraping sounds nearby as someone chips ice from a water bucket using the back of a knife. Another ordinary task made irritating by winter. A lesser-known anecdote from one emigrant account describes travellers sleeping with boots beneath blankets or even partially inside coats to prevent leather from freezing solid overnight. Anyone who forgot sometimes woke to footwear stiff enough to require careful thawing before use. You glance downward immediately. Yes, your boots are absolutely sleeping inside the wagon later. No dignity remains on the Oregon Trail after enough blizzards. You stand carefully and stretch aching legs while snow crunches beneath your soles. The camp appears ghostly beneath accumulated frost and dim lantern light. Wagons sag under fresh drifts. Ropes glitter pale with ice. Even the fires seem exhausted now. Still burning. Barely. A woman nearby checks a child's feet beneath blankets and sighs with visible relief after finding them warm. Another traveller wraps extra cloth around his ears before resuming watch beside the livestock. Everyone continues adjusting, adapting, improvising. The storm has become less dramatic during the last hour, yet somehow more draining. Not violent enough to fear constantly, just persistent enough to wear down body and mind piece by piece. Cold water seeps slowly through one knee of your trousers while kneeling near the fire. You stand immediately. Too late. The dampness spreads with depressing speed. You mutter something unprintable beneath your breath while trying unsuccessfully to dry the fabric beside the coals. The fire ignores your emotional needs completely. Far beyond the wagons, hidden behind snow clouds and darkness, morning slowly approaches. You cannot see it yet, but the night feels subtly different now. Thinner somehow. The cold remains brutal. The clothing remains damp. Your toes still feel questionable. But somewhere beyond the frozen prairie, dawn continues moving patiently toward the camp, and every traveller here waits for its arrival with the quiet desperation of people who badly need to see the world again. Long before the sky begins lightening, the camp grows quieter in a different way. Not because people are sleeping, because they are listening inward instead. The storm has worn everyone down past conversation. Voices shrink into murmurs beneath blankets and wagon covers. Movements slow. Even the animals stand more still now, their breathing steady beneath layers of snow. You sit beside the weakest remaining fire and notice how many people stare into the coals without speaking. Not unhappy exactly, just thoughtful. Fatigue creates a strange softness around human behaviour. Arguments disappear, pride loosens. The night becomes too long and cold for unnecessary performance. A woman nearby folds her hands together silently beneath her shawl, across camp. An older man removes his hat briefly before bowing his head toward the dying firelight. Another traveller hums under his breath while rubbing warmth back into stiff fingers. Small rituals survive where comfort cannot. An often overlooked historical reality is that religion and personal faith played enormous roles in the emotional lives of many Oregon Trail emigrants. Families carried Bibles, hymn books, prayer habits, and familiar routines westward alongside tools and supplies during storms, illness, or uncertainty. Those practices often became sources of structure and reassurance. You understand why. The prairie encourages reflection whether you requested it or not. Snow drifts quietly around the wagons while someone begins singing very softly from inside one of the canvas shelters. Not loudly enough for performance, just enough for nearby listeners to hear. The melody moves slowly through the darkness, carried between gusts of wind and the creaking of frozen wagon wood. You do not recognize the hymn fully, but its rhythm feels calm and familiar anyway. A child's sleepy voice briefly joins in from somewhere beneath blankets. Then silence returns again. The fire beside you settles lower with a faint hiss of collapsing ash. Orange embers pulse softly beneath grey-crusted coals. Every so often, someone nudges another small branch into the heat, extending the life of the flames a little longer. Nobody wants the fire to disappear completely before dawn. You pull your coat tighter and watch snow gathering along the edges of nearby wagon wheels. Frost sparkles faintly on ropes and harness straps whenever lantern light catches them. Everything looks gentler now despite the cold. Blurred, muted, a curious account preserved in one emigrant diary described travellers reciting poetry from memory during difficult weather crossings because books had become buried too deeply beneath supplies to retrieve easily. Entire evenings apparently passed with exhausted people trying collectively to remember half-forgotten verses beside weak fires. Human beings really will turn anything into entertainment if trapped long enough. You imagine someone dramatically misquoting poetry while wrapped in buffalo hides and damp socks. Honestly, kinda charming. From another wagon comes the soft sound of a mother telling a Bible story to restless children. Her voice remains calm and measured despite obvious exhaustion. You catch fragments only. Floodwaters, arcs, wilderness, journeys guided through uncertainty. The themes feel appropriate. Scholars continue discussing how emigrants interpreted hardship through spiritual language during westward expansion. Some travellers described storms and disasters as tests of endurance or faith. Others viewed survival itself as evidence of divine protection. Yet many personal journals also reveal frustration, fear, and doubt existing alongside belief. Listening to the quiet camp tonight, you suspect most people carried all those emotions together. Human beings rarely experience only one thing at a time. The wind rises briefly. Rattling canvas covers overhead before easing again. Snow swirls through the lantern glow in slow hypnotic spirals. You realize the storm no longer feels aggressive, only endless. The difference matters somehow. Nearby, the older woman who spent hours knitting earlier now sits motionless beneath a blanket staring into the fire. Her needles rest forgotten beside her lap. Eventually she speaks without looking up. Storm sounds different near morning. You tilt your head slightly, listening. At first you hear nothing unusual. Then gradually you notice it too. Less sharp wind, softer snowfall, the camp noises carrying farther between gusts, the night changing shape around you. A strange frontier belief sometimes appeared among emigrants that certain songs brought bad weather if sung at the wrong time on the plains. Different wagon companies blamed different melodies. Whether anyone genuinely believed this or merely enjoyed blaming unlucky weather on poor musical choices remains uncertain. Still, nobody seems eager to test the theory tonight. The silence itself has become comforting. You move slowly through camp once more, checking the lanterns. Most burn low now, their glass fogged faintly by condensation and smoke. Inside the wagons, sleeping forms shift beneath piled blankets and buffalo robes. One child murmurs something about chickens in sleep. You hope the dream involves warmer weather. The livestock remain calm near the edge of camp. Oxen breathe slow clouds into the darkness while horses occasionally flick snow from their backs. Even the mule has stopped expressing emotional opinions about existence for the moment. An encouraging sign. You return toward the fire and sit carefully on a half-frozen crate. Your muscles ache with deep, heavy exhaustion now. The kind that settles behind the eyes and inside the spine. You understand suddenly why trail travelers sometimes describe nights as something survived rather than experienced. Time stretches strangely in storms. Hours feel suspended. The prairie beyond camp remains invisible beneath darkness and snow. Somewhere under all that white, the hidden trail continues westward through mountains and valleys nobody here can currently see. Yet no one talks much about tomorrow anymore. The camp is narrowed emotionally. Warmth, shelter, fire, breathing. These things matter tonight. Everything else waits. The hymn begins again somewhere in the darkness, softer this time. Only a few lines before fading into silence once more. No grand sermon follows, no dramatic declaration, just tired people holding quietly to familiar sounds while winter presses around them from every direction. You sit beside the dying fire, listening to the stormies little by little across the prairie, and for the first time all night, the approaching dawn no longer feels impossible. As the storm weakens toward dawn, people begin talking again. Not loudly. The prairie still feels too fragile for loudness somehow, but quiet conversation returns beside the fires and beneath the wagon covers, rising slowly out of the long frozen silence like warmth returning to stiff hands. You sit inside one of the larger wagons now, knees tucked awkwardly beside a crate of tools while several travellers crowd together beneath blankets and lantern light. Snow still brushes softly across the canvas overhead, though the wind no longer shakes the wagon as violently as before. The lantern hanging near the wagon bow glows amber and low, softening every face around it. Exhaustion has made everyone gentler. An older man rubs warmth into his hands and begins telling a story about a river crossing months earlier, somewhere east of the Platte. According to him, one wagon became stuck axle deep in mud while a mule escaped its tether and wandered calmly into another family's supper. Nobody questions the accuracy of the details. Accuracy feels less important than companionship right now. Several people laugh quietly anyway. You notice how stories change the atmosphere inside the wagon almost immediately. Shoulders loosen. Faces lift slightly from their exhaustion. Even the children half asleep beneath blankets seem calmer, hearing familiar rhythms of human voices around them. This may be one of the oldest survival tools people possess. Conversation against darkness. A historical observation found repeatedly in emigrant journals is that storytelling formed a major part of camp life during long overland journeys. Travellers exchanged jokes, rumours, personal histories, trail advice, ghost stories, and memories from back east, especially during weather delays or nighttime rest periods. The Oregon Trail, it turns out, included an enormous amount of chatting. You pull the buffalo robe tighter across your legs while another traveller begins describing the first time he saw the Rocky Mountains rising out of the plains. "Thought they were clouds," he murmurs. That image settles warmly into the wagon for a moment. Cloud-shaped mountains appearing on the horizon after endless flat country. Even exhausted minds still reach for wonder. A peculiar trail rumour once circulated about abandoned wagons haunted by travellers who refused to leave prized possessions behind. Different versions involved phantom lanterns, ghostly oxen, or mysterious figures walking beside the trail during storms. Historians suspect many such tales grew from exhaustion, grief, and endless nighttime imagination. Still, nobody seems eager to camp beside deserted wagons after hearing the stories. You understand completely. The older woman with the knitting needle smiles faintly and recalls a traveller farther back along the trail who insisted on transporting a piano westward for nearly 300 miles before finally surrendering to reality and abandoning it beside the road. Several people groan in disbelief. Someone asks whether the piano survived. Another replies that the prairie probably learned music afterward. More quiet laughter follows. The wagon feels warmer now, though perhaps that warmth comes partly from voices and closeness rather than blankets alone. Condensation gathers faintly along the inside canvas where breath meets freezing air outside. You listen while stories drift from practical memories into stranger territory. Buffalo herds so large they resembled moving weather. Dust storms darkening midday skies, a snake discovered inside a flour barrel, an ox that somehow learned to untie knots. That final story receives significant skepticism. Researchers studying emigrant folklore often note how oral storytelling helped shape collective memory along the trail. Personal experiences blended with exaggeration, humour, fear, and repetition, until events became part history and part campfire mythology. Honestly, after enough sleepless nights and terrible coffee, reality probably became flexible anyway. A younger traveller begins describing a settlement farther east, where winter snow once piled so deeply that people tunnelled between buildings. One child listening beneath the blankets asks quietly whether Oregon has winters like this too. The adults hesitate. Interesting. Finally, someone answers carefully. Depends where you settle. Technically true. Emotionally evasive. You glance around the wagon and realise how many people still speak about Oregon as though it exists somewhere between geography and imagination. Rich soil, green valleys, better weather, new beginnings. A place carrying enough hope to justify all this suffering. Outside the wagon, the oxen shift softly in the snow. Their harness chains clink faintly beneath the ongoing storm. The sound blends strangely with the storytelling inside. Animal breathing. Lantern crackling. Human voices moving through memory. A lesser-known emigrant habit involved travellers carving names, initials, or messages into wagon parts, tool handles, and trail objects during long journeys. Some marks recorded dates or destinations. Others appeared entirely random, perhaps created simply because people wanted proof they existed somewhere within the enormous landscape crossing around them. You imagine tired travellers scratching initials into frozen wood beside fires much like this one, leaving tiny reminders behind against the vastness. The conversation drifts again. Now people discuss weather signs, ringed moons, bird movements, wind direction. One man insists cattle always sense heavy snow before humans do. Another argues aching joints predict storms more accurately than animals. Both theories sound equally scientific at this hour. Scholars still examine how emigrants interpreted environmental knowledge during westward migration. Folk wisdom, practical experience, indigenous guidance, rumour, and personal superstition often blended together during difficult travel conditions. Out here, certainty becomes rare enough that people trust whatever explanations help them feel prepared. The lantern flame flickers lower while the stories grow slower and softer. Fatigue settles over the wagon again gradually, pulling at voices until pauses stretch longer between sentences. One traveller begins speaking about home back east. A small farm, pear trees, summer rain. No one interrupts. You realise then how many conversations tonight circle quietly around memory. Not because people regret leaving necessarily, but because storms narrow the world so completely that familiar places begin glowing brighter in the imagination. Warm kitchens, dry beds, doors that actually block wind. Revolutionary concepts. Outside, the snowfall has weakened to a soft, steady drift against the canvas. Dawn still hides somewhere beyond the clouds, but the darkness no longer feels endless. Inside the wagon, people settle gradually back beneath blankets and buffalo robes. Stories fade into murmurs. Someone yawns loudly enough to trigger 3 more yawns immediately afterward. Human beings remain deeply vulnerable to contagious sleepiness. You lean back carefully against a crate and close your eyes for a moment, while listening to the last fragments of conversation drifting through the lantern glow. The storm still surrounds the camp. The trail remains buried beneath snow, but for now, wrapped in stories and shared exhaustion, the night feels a little less cold than before. The coughing becomes harder to ignore as the night thins toward morning. Not constant, just persistent enough that everyone notices. A rough sound from one wagon. Then silence. Then another cough somewhere farther across camp. Deep chest coughs. Dry little coughs from children. Exhausted coughing hidden behind blankets because people do not want to alarm one another unnecessarily. The storm may be easing, but the cold has already settled itself into tired lungs and aching joints. You step carefully from the wagon into pale pre-dawn darkness, carrying the lantern once more. Snow still falls lightly across the camp, though now the flakes drift lazily instead of racing sideways through the wind. Everything looks faded. The fires burn low and weak after the long night. Frostcoats wagon covers in pale crusted patterns. Even the lantern light seems tired. You move toward the wagon where the deepest coughing came from earlier. Inside, an older traveller lies wrapped beneath quilts while his daughter presses a warm cloth against his forehead. Steam rises faintly from a nearby pot set close to a tiny coal fire. The air smells of damp blankets, smoke, and boiled herbs. A recognised historical reality of trail migration is that illness spread easily among emigrants during difficult weather. Crowded sleeping conditions, exhaustion, poor nutrition, contaminated water, and constant exposure weakened immune systems long before travellers reached the mountains. Blizzards merely intensified what was already fragile. The older man opens his eyes briefly as you enter. "Just cold air," he mutters hoarsely. Everyone says that at first. The daughter gives you a tired smile clearly designed to appear more confident than she feels. You understand immediately. Nobody wants sickness to become the centre of camp attention. Fear travels quickly through the exhausted groups. You step back outside after a few quiet words and pull the cold air deep into your lungs. Your own throat feels rough from smoke and freezing wind. Everyone's probably does by now. The prairie around camp remains hidden beneath drifting snow and darkness, though the eastern horizon has begun turning faintly grey behind the clouds. Morning approaches slowly, very slowly. A curious treatment occasionally mentioned in emigrant recollections involved people rubbing frostbitten skin with snow, despite later medical advice warning against it. Frontier knowledge often mixed practical observation with inherited folk remedies. Not all of them especially useful. Human beings have always enjoyed improvising medicine under terrible circumstances. Near one of the fires, a woman heats bricks wrapped in cloth while another traveller carefully massages warmth back into stiff, pale fingers. The man winces sharply each time circulation returns. You know that pain now. The fire crackles softly between them while snow settles across their boots. No one complains much anymore. Complaining requires energy. You notice how illness changes the emotional atmosphere of the camp. Storms feel external, visible. Something endured together, but coughing, fever, and weakness creep inward quietly, reminding everyone how thin the line between survival and disaster can become out here. One injured ankle, one infection, one badly timed sickness. Sometimes that was enough. Researchers continue examining how emigrants understood medical care during westward travel. While many wagon companies carried medicine chests and home remedies, treatment options remained limited, especially far from settlements. Recovery often depended as much on rest, luck, and weather as any available medicine. Unfortunately, the trail specialized in denying people proper rest. You kneel beside another fire where a younger boy sits wrapped in blankets staring sleepily into the coals. His nose glows bright red from cold. "You sick?" you asked quietly. He shakes his head. "Just tired." Honestly, same. His mother hands him a tin cup filled with something steaming faintly. Weak broth, perhaps. Or herbal tea made from whatever survived the journey west inside somebody's carefully guarded bundle of supplies. The boy drinks slowly while snow drifts around the firelight. Nearby, one traveller unwraps a foot bandage beside the coals and grimaces at the sight underneath. You politely avoid looking too closely. Some details belong to history. Others belong very far away from bedtime listening. Still, the reality remains. Feet suffered terribly on the trail. Wet boots, frozen socks, constant walking beside wagons. Even minor injuries became serious when exposed to cold and exhaustion for weeks at a time. A little farther off, you hear quiet prayer again from one of the wagons. Softer than earlier in the night, less formal somehow, more tired. The kind of prayer spoken by people who simply want everyone to wake up safely. A peculiar frontier belief recorded in several diaries claimed certain herbs gathered along the plains could ward off sickness during difficult crossings. Some remedies probably offered genuine relief. Others likely provided little beyond comfort and strong unpleasant flavours. Still, people kept brewing them. Hope itself can feel medicinal during hard winters. You move toward the livestock again while dawn slowly strengthens behind the clouds. The animals remain alive, which already counts as good news. Frost clings heavily along their backs and harness straps. Several oxen chew slowly at feed scattered earlier through the snow. Steady chewing sounds, steady breathing. Life continuing one cold hour at a time. One horse limps slightly while shifting weight. Not severe perhaps, but enough that two travellers exchange worried glances nearby. Every small weakness matters now. The camp cannot afford many more problems. Academic debates still continue around mortality rates on the Oregon Trail, and how accurately emigrants recorded sickness and death in personal journals. Some scholars suggest emotional trauma caused survivors to compress or soften painful memories afterward. Others argue 19th century familiarity with hardship shaped how people described suffering altogether. Standing here among coughing wagons and exhausted faces, you suspect many travellers simply focused on whatever needed doing next, because dwelling emotionally on danger accomplished very little. The eastern sky brightens another shade of grey, not sunlight exactly, just less darkness. People begin emerging slowly from wagons wrapped in blankets and heavy coats. Fires receive fresh fuel. Ice gets broken from water buckets. Children blink sleepily into the frozen morning air. The storm is nearly past now, but its effects remain everywhere. Inside aching lungs, inside frozen boots, inside tired bodies stiff from cold and worry. You stand beside the fading fire and watch thin smoke drift upward through the pale pre-dawn sky. Another night survived. Not comfortably, not easily, but survived all the same. Morning finally arrives with all the enthusiasm of a tired clerk opening a dusty office. No dramatic sunrise greets the camp. No golden light pours heroically across the prairie. Instead, dawn seeps slowly through thick cloud cover until the darkness merely becomes grey enough for everyone to see how much snow buried them overnight. And honestly, that feels rude. You step out from beneath the wagon cover into air so cold it almost tastes metallic. The storm has mostly passed now, though fine snow still drifts lazily across the plains beneath a pale, colourless sky. The camp looks transformed. Wagons sit half buried along their lower edges. Snowdrifts curl around wheel spokes and wagon tongues like frozen waves. Ropes hang stiff with ice. Buffalo robes left too near the open air now glitter white with frost. Even the fires appear overwhelmed. Thin streams of smoke rise weakly from shallow pits nearly swallowed by snow. Nobody speaks much at first. People simply stare, taking inventory, counting wagons, counting animals, counting one another. A commonly acknowledged detail from emigrant accounts is that mornings after major storms often began with silence and assessment before activity resumed. Travellers needed to determine whether animals survived. Supplies remained usable, and routes ahead were still passable. The prairie demanded morning reports before granting permission to continue. You pull your coat tighter and step carefully through snow, nearly reaching your knees in some places. Beneath the fresh drifts, hidden ice makes every movement uncertain. One wrong step sends you sliding sideways against a buried wagon wheel. Elegant. A nearby child laughs at you immediately. Wonderful. Humiliation remains alive and healthy on the frontier. The oxen emerge slowly from the storm's aftermath. Huge pale shapes coated in crusted snow. Several travellers move among them, checking harnesses and legs for injuries. Steam rises faintly from the animals where morning air meets body heat. One horse shakes itself violently, sending snow spraying across two exhausted men already in terrible moods. The horse, clearly pleased with this accomplishment, resumes chewing hay. A curious incident described in one emigrant diary involved travellers waking after a blizzard to discover an entire wagon, nearly hidden beneath drifted snow except for the top edge of the canvas cover. Exaggerated, perhaps. Then again, looking around this camp now, maybe not by much. You brush accumulated snow from a supply crate and immediately uncover another layer frozen solid underneath. Everything requires effort this morning, even simple visibility. The eastern horizon remains hidden beneath heavy grey clouds, though the snowfall itself has weakened to occasional drifting flakes. The wind no longer roars across the prairie. Instead, it moves quietly now, carrying the softer sounds of waking camp life. Axes striking frozen wood, people coughing, children whining sleepily about cold boots, someone muttering darkly at a stubborn wagon latch. The normal orchestra of survival resumes. You crouch beside one of the fire pits while two travellers attempt to coax fresh flames from buried embers. Smoke pours directly into everyone's faces at once. Naturally, the fire eventually catches anyway, producing a low orange glow and the familiar smell of wet wood and ash. Hands immediately gather around the heat from every direction. A serious academic discussion continues around how emigrants measured weather severity in personal writings. Some historians believe 19th century travellers often normalised extreme conditions because harsh environments formed regular parts of rural life already familiar to them. Others argue surviving accounts still reveal profound psychological strain hidden beneath restrained language. Looking across this camp now, restraint seems understandable. People are simply too tired for drama. You help dig around one wagon wheel buried almost halfway in drifted snow. The work quickly warms your shoulders despite the cold air. Snow squeaks sharply beneath boots and shovel blades. That sound surprises you. Dry cold snow has its own voice. Sharp, crisp, almost glass-like. Nearby, a woman hangs blankets across a wagon rail hoping the weak morning air might dry them slightly. Another traveller chips ice from a barrel while muttering that the planes should be arrested for unreasonable behaviour. Fair point. Children emerge gradually from beneath blankets and wagon covers wrapped in oversized coats and scarves. Their cheeks glow pink from cold. One little girl immediately begins poking at a snowdrift with a stick despite the exhaustion surrounding everyone else. Childhood remains impressively committed to curiosity. You realise then how strange the camp smells after the storm. Less smoke now. More snow. Cold air strips scents down to essentials. Wet leather. Animal fur. Damp wool thawing near weak fires. Coffee brewing somewhere nearby with stubborn frontier optimism. One older traveller finally announces what everyone already suspects. The trail's gone. Heads turn quietly toward the open prairie. He is right. No wagon ruts remain visible beyond the camp perimeter. Snow has erased every mark completely. The land stretches outward, smooth and pale beneath the grey sky, offering no obvious direction west at all. You feel the mood shift immediately. Not panic exactly, something heavier. A realization settling collectively across exhausted minds. Researchers still examine how emigrants navigated after major storms obscured landmarks and trail markers. Some wagon companies waited for clearer conditions or followed experienced guides. Others risked movement based on instinct, terrain memory, or scattered signs barely visible beneath snow. None of those options sound especially comforting. A lesser-known frontier habit involved travellers climbing wagon tongues or nearby rises after storms, simply to scan the horizon for recognisable shapes. Rivers, hills, tree lines. Anything offering orientation again. Several men already attempt exactly that now. The results appear discouraging. Grey sky, white prairie, nothing else. You warm your hands briefly around a fresh tin cup of coffee while watching smoke drift low across the snow-covered camp. Around you, movement increases gradually as people begin confronting the practical realities of mourning. Harness repairs, frozen clothing, buried supplies, hungry animals. No one receives extra rest because the storm was inconvenient. The prairie remains wonderfully unsympathetic. Still, the fact that people move at all feels important. The camp survived the night. Cold and exhausted, yes, but alive. And as the pale winter morning slowly brightens over the snow-buried wagons, everyone begins preparing for the next difficult decision the trail intends to demand from them. The digging begins almost immediately after breakfast, not because anyone feels energetic. Quite the opposite. People move with the stiff, heavy motions of bodies that barely slept and never fully warmed during the night. Yet the work cannot wait. Snow surrounds the wagons too deeply for travel, and every passing hour risks more frozen equipment, colder animals, and worsening exhaustion. So everyone starts digging. You grip a shovel with aching hands and attack the nearest drift beside a buried wheel. The snow feels lighter near the surface, then suddenly heavier and packed hard beneath. Each scrape produces a sharp crunch against hidden ice underneath. The sound repeats across camp in uneven rhythm. Scrape, lift, throw, breathe, repeat. An accepted historical detail from many trail accounts is that emigrants often spent entire mornings after storms clearing snow, repairing equipment, and restoring camp functionality before even considering travel. Severe weather delays could consume precious days during late-season crossings, and time out here feels almost physical. Heavy, expensive. You pause briefly to catch your breath while steam rises from your coat despite the freezing air. Around you, the camp has transformed into a slow-moving construction site, buried beneath winter. Children drag smaller piles of snow away from wagon tongues using cooking pans and bits of wood. Men chop frozen ice from wheel spokes. Women shake blankets, relight fires, reorganize supplies, and thaw stiff clothing beside weak sunlight filtering through the clouds. Nobody stands idle for long. Even exhaustion has chores. Nearby, two travelers struggle to free a wagon wheel frozen partly into the ground beneath drifted snow and slush. Every attempt produces new muttering about the moral failures of winter. You sympathize deeply. The oxen watch all this activity with calm, prehistoric indifference while chewing frozen hay. Their patience feels almost insulting at this point. One mule, however, remains emotionally committed to chaos. It pulls loose from a poorly tied line and immediately wanders toward a pile of drying blankets with malicious curiosity. 3 people react at once. The mule appears delighted. A strange but genuine frontier anecdote tells of emigrants occasionally losing valuable supplies beneath snowfall, simply because items became buried overnight and blended completely into the landscape by morning. Small tools, cooking pots, clothing bundles, and even food sacks sometimes vanish temporarily into the drifts. Looking around camp now, you absolutely believe it. Half the morning already seems devoted to rediscovering possessions people swear existed yesterday. You help dig around a partially buried supply crate near the rear of one wagon. Snow is frozen solid around the edges, forcing you to chip carefully with a shovel blade. Inside the crate, thankfully, the flour remains dry. The mood nearby improves immediately. Food surviving the storm counts as victory. The clouds overhead thin slightly sometime later, allowing pale, weak sunlight to spill across the prairie. The brightness reflects harshly off the snow until everyone squints against it. After the long, dark night, even daylight feels unfamiliar. You climb briefly onto a wagon tongue to stretch your back and scan the horizon. The prairie extends outward in every direction, smooth and white beneath the grey sky. No visible trail remains. No clear wagon ruts. Only drifting lines of snow shaped by the night wind. Farther away, a few darker shapes finally emerge through the fair clearing weather. Low hills, perhaps, or distant trees. The camp leader studies them with narrowed eyes. Researchers continue examining how wagon companies reoriented themselves after storms erased familiar routes. Some groups relied heavily on experienced guides or hunters who recognized terrain features beneath snow cover. Others moved cautiously from landmark to landmark once visibility improved. You suspect confidence mattered almost as much as navigation skill. Hesitation could become its own danger. Back near the fires, someone has finally managed stronger flames using wood kept dry beneath wagon beds overnight. The smell of hot coffee spreads quickly across camp again, drawing exhausted people toward the warmth like migrating birds. You accept a tin cup gratefully. The coffee remains terrible, but now it tastes slightly hopeful. A curious trail habit occasionally mentioned in emigrant recollections involved naming particularly difficult wagons after the owner's least favourite relatives, politicians, or farm animals. Considering how much repair work these vehicles demanded, the emotional logic becomes understandable very quickly. One traveller nearby currently refers to his wagon only as that cursed beast. Honestly, fair. The camp slowly begins recovering shape beneath the work. Wagon wheels emerge from drifts. Feed sacks reappear. Paths form between fires and livestock lines where repeated footsteps compress the snow. Movement returns. Life resumes its forward-leaning posture. A child suddenly shouts triumphantly after uncovering a missing cooking spoon buried near a snowbank. Several adults applaud with exaggerated seriousness. Morale, it turns out, occasionally depends on cutlery. You kneel beside another wheel, helping clear pack snow from the axle housing. Meltwater soaks instantly through one knee of your trousers, despite yesterday's miserable lessons about damp fabric. Wonderful. The prairie apparently believes repetition strengthens character. A continuing academic debate surrounds how much cooperation existed between wagon families during difficult stretches of the Oregon Trail. Some historians emphasize strong communal support systems, while others point toward tensions over resources, leadership, and exhaustion. Watching the camp now, both seem likely. People help each other constantly. People also look one bad inconvenience away from strangling someone with frozen rope. The cold sharpens emotions as efficiently as it sharpens air. Still, progress continues. By late morning, several wagons stand mostly cleared and ready for movement if needed. Fires burn stronger. Children stomp narrow trails through the snow. Horses shake ice from their manes beneath weak sunlight. The storm no longer controls every moment. That matters psychologically. You hear laughter suddenly near the livestock line, and turn to see two men trying unsuccessfully to push a stubborn mule sideways out of a drift. The mule refuses entirely, standing motionless with the deep spiritual confidence of a creature that knows human schedules are meaningless. Eventually it moves precisely one step. Everyone involved looks exhausted afterward. You sip the last of your coffee while staring west across the hidden trail. The snow still covers everything. The mountains still wait somewhere ahead beyond sight. The journey remains dangerous, cold, and uncertain. Yet around you the camp keeps rebuilding itself piece by piece beneath the pale winter sky. Because survival on the Oregon Trail rarely arrived through dramatic heroics. Usually it looked exactly like this. Tired people with frozen hands digging one wagon wheel free at a time. By midday, the camp faces the question everyone has quietly avoided since dawn. Do you move forward, or stay where you are another night? The discussion begins beside the largest fire. Though nobody formally announces it, people simply gather gradually while warming stiff hands around tin cups and staring west across the snow-covered prairie. The hidden trail waits somewhere beyond sight. So do the mountains. You stand near the edge of the group, listening while the camp leader studies the horizon with narrowed eyes. Weak sunlight filters through the clouds now, bright enough to reveal distance again, but not enough to soften the frozen landscape. Snow stretches outward, smooth and untouched beyond the camp, beautiful from far away, threatening once you remember wagons must cross it. A recognized historical truth of Oregon Trail travel is that difficult weather often forced emigrants into painful logistical decisions. Delaying travel consumed food, fuel, and time. Moving too quickly risked injury, exhaustion, or becoming trapped farther from shelter. There were rarely perfect choices, only different kinds of risk. One traveller argues the sky looks clearer westward already. Another insists the drifts remain too deep for loaded wagons. A third quietly points out that two oxen still appear weak from the storm. Nobody raises their voice. Fatigue has sanded down everyone's anger into something flatter and heavier. You sip weak coffee while listening to the debate drift back and forth through cold air and smoke. Move now! Wait longer! Scout ahead first. Rest the animals. Push west before another storm arrives. The prairie offers no helpful opinions whatsoever. A peculiar frontier habit sometimes appeared during difficult delays where emigrants spread personal belongings across wagon covers or snowbanks to reassess what truly needed carrying west. After enough hardship, objects once considered essential suddenly looked suspiciously unnecessary. Human beings become remarkably practical after dragging furniture through blizzards. You glance toward a nearby pile of abandoned items already gathering beside one wagon. A cracked chair leg, broken cookware, extra wooden boxes, a heavy iron tool nobody wants to admit they never actually used. The trail slowly teaches people the difference between valuable and merely heavy. One woman unwraps a small porcelain dish from cloth beside the fire and stares at it silently for several seconds before rewrapping it again. That object will continue west, not because it is practical, because it matters. Researchers continue discussing how emigrants balanced emotional attachment against survival needs during long migrations. Some accounts emphasize ruthless practicality under pressure. Others reveal surprising determination to preserve keepsakes, books, heirlooms, or fragile reminders of home despite extreme hardship. People do not travel west carrying only supplies. They carry identity too. The camp leader eventually sends 2 riders out slowly across the snow to search for signs of the buried trail ahead. The horses move carefully through the drifts, their dark shapes shrinking gradually against the pale landscape until distance swallows them whole. Everyone watches longer than necessary after they disappear. Silence settles again afterward. The waiting begins. Meanwhile, work continues because the frontier never pauses politely for emotional tension. Fires need feeding, harnesses require repair, children need food and dry clothing. Snow still clings stubbornly around several wagon wheels despite hours of digging. You help reorganize supplies beside one wagon, while 2 travelers argue quietly over weight distribution. Flour sacks shift. Toolboxes move. Blankets get repacked tighter against moisture. Every item sparks calculation now. Could you survive without it? Could the oxen travel more safely if it disappeared? Would you regret abandoning it forever beside the trail? These questions linger over nearly every object. A little farther away, one family quietly decides to leave behind a heavy cast iron stove they carried all the way from Missouri. The father scrapes snow away carefully before setting the stove beside a drift near the edge of camp. No ceremony follows. Still, everyone notices. A lesser-known detail from emigrant diaries describes travelers occasionally marking abandoned belongings with names or messages before leaving them behind. Some hoped to retrieve items later. Others simply wanted acknowledgement that sacrifice had occurred. You imagine thousands of lost objects scattered invisibly along forgotten stretches of trail westward. Tiny archaeological footprints of difficult choices. The afternoon light brightens slightly as clouds thin overhead. For the first time since the storm began, faint blue appears in patches between the grey. The sight changes camp morale instantly. Children point upward excitedly. Several adults smile despite themselves. Amazing what visible sky can do for exhausted minds. One of the returning scouts finally appears near the western horizon sometime later, horse moving steadily through the snow. The second rider follows farther behind. Conversations stop immediately. Everyone watches. The scout reaches camp coated in frost and snow before sliding stiffly from the saddle. "Trail's there," he says after catching his breath. "Hard to follow, but there." Relief moves visibly through the camp like warmth spreading through frozen hands. Not certainty, just possibility. That feels sufficient for now. Scholars still analyze how information and rumor shaped emigrant decision-making across the Oregon Trail. Weather reports, guidebook advice, trail gossip, and scout observations often carried enormous influence despite varying reliability. People learned quickly that incomplete information remained better than none at all, especially in winter. The discussion resumes beside the fire, this time with direction. Move tomorrow at first light if conditions hold. Travel carefully. Keep the wagons closer together. Watch the animals. Practical decisions begin replacing uncertainty. You realize how much emotional energy the waiting itself consumed. Action, even risky action, feels easier somehow. As evening approaches again, the camp settles into preparation mode. Harnesses get inspected twice. Snow clears further from wheel paths. Coffee boils once more over rebuilding fires. The sky overhead finally reveals a thin line of fading gold beneath the clouds in the west. The first real colour anyone has seen in nearly 2 days. You stand beside the wagon line watching that narrow strip of light, while cold air settles slowly across the prairie once more. Tomorrow the journey continues. The trail remains buried. The mountains remain distant. But the camp has chosen movement over fear. And out here on the frozen plains, that decision alone feels almost heroic. Years from now, people will remember this night differently. That realization comes quietly while you stand beside the wagons, watching evening settle across the snow-covered prairie once more. The storm has passed now. The sky above the western horizon glows pale gold, fading slowly into blue-grey twilight. For the first time in what feels like forever, you can actually see distance again. Low hills rise faintly beyond the buried trail. Thin lines of dark brush cut across the snow. Farther west, hidden beneath cloud and fading light, the mountains wait patiently for the wagon train to continue toward them tomorrow. The camp itself feels calmer tonight. Still cold, still exhausted, but calmer. Fires burn stronger after a full day of digging and preparation. Lanterns glow warmly between the wagons. Children move through the packed snow paths, laughing softly, while adults finish evening chores. You notice people talking about the storm already as though it belongs slightly to the past. That happens fast. Human beings begin turning survival into memory almost immediately. A broadly accepted historical observation is that emigrants often reflected on difficult trail experiences with surprising complexity in later years. Hardships that felt terrifying in the moment sometimes became stories of endurance, humour, or even nostalgia when remembered afterward. Memory softens edges eventually. Not all of them, but enough. You crouch beside one of the fires while coffee boils nearby in a blackened pot. Smoke rises straight upward now that the wind has mostly vanished. The air smells cleaner tonight, less panic hidden beneath it somehow. One older traveller describes another blizzard he survived years earlier, farther east near the Missouri River. According to him, snow buried an entire chicken coop except for the roof peak. Someone immediately accuses him of exaggeration. He grins, maybe a little. The camp laughs softly around the fire. And just like that, hardship becomes entertainment. A curious detail preserved in several emigrant recollections involves people collecting odd souvenirs from difficult crossings, bent horseshoes, broken wagon bolts, strange stones found beside campsites, small physical reminders that later anchored enormous memories. You glance toward the abandoned stove still sitting beside the drift at the edge of camp. Even discarded objects carry stories now. Nearby, the younger children have begun treating snow piles as tiny forts despite yesterday's misery. One little boy proudly throws a snowball directly at a wagon wheel and misses by an impressive margin. His sister applauds anyway. Children possess an extraordinary ability to separate adventure from suffering, depending entirely on mood and available snacks. The fires crackle steadily while twilight deepens across the prairie. Somewhere beyond the livestock line, the mule brays again with renewed emotional confidence after surviving the storm. Several adults groan immediately. Good. Nature is healing. You lean back against a wagon wheel and listen while conversations drift around the camp. People compare storms from earlier years, discuss rumours about mountain passes farther west, debate whether tomorrow's snow will hold firm enough beneath wagon wheels. Normal camp talk has returned. That alone feels important. A continuing scholarly discussion examines how emigrants emotionally framed hardship after reaching Oregon or California. Some later memoirs emphasized courage and perseverance. Others focused more heavily on grief, danger, or exhaustion. Historians suspect the stories people chose to tell often reflected what they needed their sacrifices to mean afterward. You understand that now. How else do people carry memories this heavy? One woman near the fire quietly recalls a winter back east before the journey began. Ice along a riverbank, church bells across snowy fields, warm kitchens crowded with relatives. Her voice softens while describing it. Nobody interrupts. The prairie around the camp grows darker, little by little, beneath emerging stars. Real stars this time. Finally visible between thinning clouds after 2 endless days of grey sky. Everyone notices them. Several travellers actually stop mid-conversation just to look upward. The sky feels enormous tonight. Clear weather after storms often carried powerful emotional weight for emigrants. Many diary entries describe relief, gratitude, or renewed optimism after prolonged exposure to severe conditions. Open skies meant navigation, visibility, and movement again. But more than that, clear skies reminded people the world still extended beyond immediate suffering. You feel that deeply while staring upward now. The stars look painfully sharp in the freezing air. A lesser-known frontier belief suggested certain bright stars visible during winter crossings served as signs of safe weather ahead. Whether emigrants genuinely trusted such ideas or simply found comfort in assigning meaning to the sky remains uncertain. Still, several travellers point toward the constellations tonight with visible relief. People need hopeful patterns. The coffee finally finishes boiling and gets passed carefully around the fire circle once more. You take a cup and hold it between both hands while warmth seeps slowly through your gloves. The taste remains aggressively terrible. Tradition matters. Nearby, someone begins singing quietly again. Not the weary hymn from earlier in the storm. Something lighter now. A familiar tune from back east about rivers and home. Several others join softly. No performance. Just tired voices blending beneath the winter sky. You realise suddenly that years later, many people here may barely remember the exact cold of this storm. They may forget the frozen boots, the damp blankets, the endless digging, but they will remember moments. Lantern light on snow, children asleep beneath quilts, coffee beside the fire, the sound of singing after the wind finally stopped. Human memory works strangely that way. Researchers still debate how much nostalgia shapes later Oregon Trail narratives. Some historians argue survivors romanticize suffering over time, turning brutal experiences into national mythology. Others believe memory simply filtered events through gratitude for survival. Probably both. The prairie encourages reflection. The night deepens fully now. Fires burn lower. Conversations soften. One by one, people retreat again toward blankets and wagon covers in preparation for tomorrow's travel westward. But tonight feels different from the storm night before. Not safer exactly, just steadier. The camp survived. The wagons remain standing. The trail still exists somewhere beneath the snow. And beneath the cold, bright stars of the prairie, tired travellers settle quietly beside fading fires, already beginning the slow human process of transforming hardship into memory. Morning comes more gently this time. Not warm. The prairie has no intention of becoming kind overnight. But the air feels calmer when you step from the wagon before dawn, and the sky above the camp opens slowly into pale silver rather than threatening grey. The storm has finally moved on. Snow lies smooth across the plains in long, quiet drifts reflecting the earliest light. Wagon wheels stand half uncovered now after yesterday's labour. Harnesses hang ready beside the livestock line. Thin streams of smoke rise from rebuilding fires straight into the still morning air. Everything feels quieter after surviving something difficult. You hear it immediately. No screaming wind, no canvas snapping violently overhead. Just soft footsteps in packed snow. Low animal breathing. The faint crackle of breakfast fires beginning again. The camp moves carefully through the cold morning like people waking from an uneasy dream. You pull your coat tighter and walk slowly between the wagons while the eastern horizon brightens behind distant clouds. Frost sparkles pale blue along wheel rims and rope lines. Boots crunch softly across the frozen ground. The sound feels oddly comforting now. A familiar historical pattern appears repeatedly in emigrant diaries from difficult crossings once storms ended and movement resumed. Many travellers slip quickly back into routine despite exhaustion or fear lingering beneath the surface. Survival depended partly on continuing forward before doubt settled too deeply. The trail rewarded motion. You pause beside the livestock while several travellers harness the oxen for departure. The animals move stiffly at first, steam rolling from their nostrils into the cold air. One horse tosses snow from its mane. The mule, for reasons known only to itself, appears unusually cheerful this morning. Disturbing, children emerge from wagons wrapped in blankets, while mothers straighten coats and scarves with tired hands. Someone passes around hot coffee. Someone else counts flour sacks again for reassurance. Practicality returns before optimism does. You notice the abandoned stove still sitting beside the drift near the edge of camp. Snow has already gathered lightly across its iron surface overnight. Yesterday it belonged to someone. Today it belongs to the prairie. A strange trail custom occasionally mentioned in emigrant recollections involved travellers quietly greeting abandoned objects left beside the road as they passed. Broken wheels, crates, furniture, small reminders of earlier wagon trains struggling westward through the same enormous landscape. People recognize themselves in those objects. You understand why now. The camp leader finally signals preparation to move. Harness chains clink softly. Wagon covers get tightened. Fires collapse beneath scattered snow as the last warmth disappears into the freezing morning air. The sound of wheels moving again after the long storm feels almost emotional. Slow creaking wood, frozen axles complaining, oxen leaning into leather straps, the entire wagon train awakening gradually into motion. You walk beside one of the wagons as it rolls carefully forward through the packed snow path carved yesterday. The wheels groan at first, reluctant after being frozen in place so long. Then they turn steadily westward. The hidden trail slowly reveals itself beyond camp. Not clearly, just faint depressions and hardened tracks beneath the snow where earlier wagons once passed before the storm erased them. Enough to follow, enough to continue. Researchers continue exploring how emigrants psychologically adapted to endless uncertainty during westward migration. Some scholars argue repeated hardship built resilience over time. Others suggest travellers survived partly by narrowing attention to immediate manageable tasks rather than overwhelming long-term fears. Watching the wagons move now, that second explanation feels especially true. Nobody discusses the full journey this morning, only the next hill, the next crossing, the next camp. The prairie stretches outward around you, bright and silent beneath the pale winter sky. Snow glitters across the plains in soft, endless waves, far away. The mountains finally emerge faintly through the clearing air, blue shapes resting against the horizon. Waiting, you realize then that this night, miserable as it felt while living through it, will eventually shrink into memory, one storm among many, one cold camp along thousands of miles of trail. Yet it will remain too, inside tired bodies remembering frozen mornings, in such stories told years later beside safer fires, inside children who will grow older still hearing the creak of wagons beneath winter stars somewhere deep in memory. The oxen continue pulling westward slowly through the snow, steady, patient, uncomplaining. You glance back once more toward the abandoned campsite now fading behind the wagon train. Snow-covered fire pits, flattened drifts where wagons stood, a few dark scraps of ash scattered across the white ground. Soon even those traces will disappear. The prairie keeps very few souvenirs. The morning light grows softer as the sun climbs hidden behind thin clouds. Travellers settle into the slow rhythm of movement again. Boots crunch, wheels creak. Breath fogs the air in quiet, steady bursts. Nobody speaks much. They do not need to. The storm already said everything necessary, and gradually, as the wagon train continues westward across the frozen plains, the tension that gripped the camp through the long blizzard night begins loosening little by little inside your chest. The cold remains, the uncertainty remains, but movement itself brings comfort now. You pull your coat tighter and keep walking beside the wagons while snow sparkles softly beneath the waking sky. The prairie stretches endlessly ahead, calm at last beneath pale winter light. The oxen breathe slow white clouds into the morning. Lanterns have been extinguished. The fires are gone. Only the trail remains, leading quietly westward through snow, memory, and distance. And as the wheels turn steadily onward across the sleeping plains, your thoughts begin softening too. The wind no longer bites. The darkness no longer presses close around the wagons. The long night has passed. You feel the slow rhythm of the journey settling around you again. Creaking wood, crunching snow, gentle movement beneath the pale sky. Nothing urgent now, nothing loud, only the quiet endless motion westward. The prairie widens softly into silence, and somewhere beyond the frozen horizon, beyond the storms and mountains and tired miles still waiting ahead, rest finally begins to feel possible. The wagon train keeps moving through the calm white morning while the sky slowly brightens overhead. Snow drifts softly across the plains now, no longer threatening, only settling gently over the endless land as though the storm itself has grown tired and finally decided to sleep. You walk beside the wagons a little longer, listening to the peaceful repetition of wheels turning through packed snow, harness chains clinking softly, and oxen breathing warm clouds into the cold air. The sounds blend together into something steady and almost comforting now. Familiar, safe enough for this moment. Behind you, the old campsite disappears slowly beneath distance and snowfall. Soon there will be no sign anyone stayed there at all. No fire pits, no footprints, no wagon circles pressed into the snow. Just smooth white prairie stretching quietly beneath the winter sky. I feel strangely calming. The trail does not hold on to hardship forever. It lets things pass. The travellers around you grow quieter as the morning continues. Some ride silently in the wagons wrapped beneath blankets. Others walk with heads lowered against the cold, saving energy for the miles ahead. Children drift back to sleep beneath quilts, while the adults watch the hidden road westward unfold one careful step at a time. Even the animals seem calmer now. The mule no longer complains. The horses move steadily. The oxen continue with their slow, patient strength, asking for very little except warmth, rest, and another day to keep going. And somehow, after the long storm, that feels like enough. The pale winter sunlight spreads softly across the snow while the wagon train moves farther west into the enormous quiet of the plains. The air feels still, clean, sleepy almost. And little by little, the frozen night fades behind you like a distant dream carried away across the prairie wind. Sweet dreams.